The thermal mug of lukewarm coffee Elena Vance held in her left hand didn't tremble when Captain Miller tapped on the glass of the lead Humvee at 0345. But the way he avoided her eyes told her he was about to make the mistake she'd been tracking for 300 miles of dust and bad intentions. Outside, the air of the high desert was a thin, freezing needle that poked at the lungs, a sharp contrast to the stale, recirculated heater breath inside the vehicle. Elena didn't roll down the window immediately. She watched the way Miller's jaw stayed set, the muscle jumping near his ear, a tell she'd noted 3 weeks ago back at Fort Carson during the final pre-deployment spin-up. He was a man who had decided that speed was a substitute for certainty. He was a man who thought the silence of the valley was an invitation rather than a held breath. Elena took a slow sip of the coffee, bitter, burnt, and tasting faintly of the plastic lining of the carafe, before she finally hit the toggle. The window slid down with a gritty, mechanical protest, letting in the smell of sagebrush, diesel exhaust, and the looming, metallic scent of a storm that wasn't made of rain. "Stay in the truck, Vance," Miller said, his voice clipped and dry, already turning his head toward the line of 50 men checking their optics and cinching their plates in the pre-dawn gloom. He didn't look at her, because he didn't want to see the data she was holding on the ruggedized laptop propped against the dashboard. He didn't want to hear about the 3-decibel spike in the ambient acoustic floor she'd recorded 10 minutes ago, or the way the local wildlife had gone utterly mute in a 400-meter radius around the mouth of the draw. To Miller, she was a sensor attachment, a necessary piece of bureaucratic padding sent from a basement in Virginia to make sure the boxes were checked. To the men of Alpha Company, she was the woman who lived in the air-conditioned dark of the vehicle, staring at green and black ghosts while they did the real work of carrying 60 pounds of gear through the shale. "I've got a localized seismic signature at the 300-meter mark," Captain Elena said, her voice a calm, level anchor. "It's too rhythmic for a rock slide and too heavy for a coyote. It's a mechanical idol, muffled, probably a suppressed generator or a heavy-duty winch. They're waiting for the center of the column to clear the first bend." Miller finally looked at her then, but it wasn't the look of a commander considering a tactical pivot. It was the look of a man who had been awake for 48 hours and was tired of being told that the shadows had teeth. "You've been seeing mechanical idols since we crossed the wire, Sergeant," he said. "You saw them at the bridge, and you saw them at the wellhead. Both times, we found nothing but wind and old tin cans. My boys are on a clock. The HVTs are moving, and if we don't interdict now, we lose the window. You stay here with the drivers. Watch your screens. Call it in if you see something on the thermal, but stop chasing ghosts on the audio. That's an order." He didn't wait for her to acknowledge. He slapped the door of the Humvee twice, a hollow, metallic thud that echoed too loudly in the basin, and walked toward the head of the file. Elena watched him go, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She didn't beg. She didn't argue. She didn't point out that she had graduated top of her class at Huachuca, or that her ghosts had saved a Special Forces ODA in the Panjshir 3 years ago when everyone else thought the radio silence was just a hardware failure. She simply reached out and adjusted the gain on her headset, the movement precise and economical. She was a woman built on the foundation of Sandusky, Ohio, a place where the winters were long and the people were made of iron and silence. Her father had been a machinist at the ball bearing plant, a man who could tell if a lathe was off by 1/1000th of an inch just by the vibration in the floorboards. He taught her that the world was a series of systems, and every system had a hum. If you listened long enough, the hum told you exactly when the break was coming. She watched the 50 men move out, their silhouettes blurring into the gray-black of the canyon walls. They moved well, a disciplined snake of flickering infrared strobes and the soft crunch of boots on gravel. Specialist Kalin, the driver of her vehicle, a 19-year-old from a dirt road in Georgia who still had the habit of humming country songs under his breath, looked over at her. He was the only one who didn't look at her like she was a ghost hunter. He'd seen her find a buried pressure plate 2 weeks ago just by noticing the way the wind sounded different passing over a patch of disturbed earth. "Sergeant," Kalin whispered, his hands tight on the steering wheel. You think they are walking into it? Elena didn't answer immediately. She leaned back, closing her eyes, letting the visual data fade so she could focus entirely on the feed coming through her high-sensitivity directional mics. The world became a landscape of sound. She heard the distant, rhythmic throb of a predator drone circling 5 miles up, a sound like a persistent mosquito. She heard the clink of a loose carabiner on a soldier's pack 300 yards away. She heard the heavy, labored breathing of a SAW gunner who was struggling with the altitude. And then, beneath it all, she heard the negative space. It was the sound of a valley that had been scrubbed of its natural life. No crickets, no night birds, just the low, subsonic thrum of something massive and metal hidden behind the limestone ribs of the canyon. "They're already in it, Kaylin," she said, her voice barely a breath. "The trap isn't the canyon. The trap is the timing." She had joined the army not because of a recruiter's poster or a sense of cinematic glory, but because of a Tuesday afternoon in 2014 when she realized she could hear her own house dying. She'd been standing in the kitchen, and she'd heard the specific, agonizing groan of a support beam in the basement that was about to give way under the weight of a record-breaking snowfall. She'd pulled her younger brother out of the living room 5 seconds before the ceiling collapsed. No one else had heard it. Not her mother, not the neighbors. Just Elena. She realized then that the world was screaming its secrets all the time, and most people were just too loud to hear them. The military gave that gift a name and a paycheck. They called it acoustic intelligence. They gave her millions of dollars of sensors and told her to listen to the earth. But they hadn't given her the one thing she actually needed: the rank to make a man like Miller stop walking when she told him the ground was about to swallow him whole. The minutes ticked by on the Humvee's digital clock. 0402, 0405. The column was deep in the draw now, a place the locals called the Devil's Throat. It was a natural bottleneck, a narrow passage where the rock walls rose 60 feet on either side, slick with ancient moisture and shadow. Elena watched the thermal feed. The men were glowing heat signatures, small pulses of orange against the deep purple of the rock. They were halfway through the narrowest point. Miller's voice crackled over the net, sounding far too confident. "CP, this is Alpha Lead. We are at phase line red. No contact. The objective is in sight, proceeding to breach." Elena reached for the radio, her finger hovering over the transmit button. She knew the protocol. She was an attachment. She was supposed to keep the channel clear for tactical traffic. If she broke in now with more vibe-based intel, Miller would likely have her reprimanded before the sun was fully up. But she wasn't looking at the tactical map. She was looking at the waterfall display on her acoustic monitor. The subsonic thrum had stopped. That was the tell. You don't turn off a generator unless you don't need the power anymore, or unless you're trying to be perfectly silent for the kill. "Alpha Lead, this is Vance," she said, her voice cutting through the static like a scalpel. "The seismic signature has terminated. That means they've achieved their position. Pull them back. You have an elevated acoustic signature on the ridgeline, north-northwest. It's not wind, Captain. It's the sound of safety catches being flipped. 50 of them." "Vance, stay off the net," Miller's voice snapped back, his frustration boiling over. "We are 10 meters from the breach." "Do not," the rest of his sentence was eaten by a sound that didn't need a sensor to be heard. It was a low, rolling boom that shook the Humvee, a concussive wave that rattled the glass in its frames. On the thermal screen, the mouth of the canyon vanished in a blossom of white-hot light. A rock slide, triggered by a series of shaped charges, began to tumble down the north wall, a cascading curtain of limestone that cut the column in half. Elena didn't scream. She didn't gasp. Her hands moved with a cold, mechanical grace. She was already retasking the overhead drone, overriding the preset orbit to bring the camera's eye directly over the kill box. "Kaylin," she said, her voice dropping an octave, solid and unshakable. "Start the engine. We're moving up." "Captain said stay in the truck, Sergeant." Kaylin's eyes were wide, the reflection of the distant explosion flickering in his pupils. "The captain is currently pinned under 20 tons of rock or fighting for his life in a crossfire," Elena said, not looking at him, her eyes locked on the scrolling data. The orders changed the second the first charge went off. "Move the vehicle, specialist." Now, she felt the Humvee roar to life, the vibrations of the engine merging with the frantic chatter now flooding the radio. It was a chaos of sound, screams for medics, the stuttering roar of M249 SAW fire, the panicked commands of NCOs trying to find cover where there was none. Elena ignored the noise and focused on the signals. She adjusted her headset, tuning out the human panic to find the enemy's rhythm. She could hear them now. They were above, on the rim. They weren't using radios, they were using whistles, high-frequency, short-burst signals that blended with the wind. To anyone else, it was just the environment. To Elena, it was a map of the ambush. "They're not just at the front," she muttered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "They're leapfrogging. They've got a second element moving toward the rear. They're going to seal the exit." She grabbed the handset for the long-range radio, her voice cutting through the screaming on the company net. "All Alpha elements, this is Vance. The ridgeline is not clear. Repeat, the ridgeline is not clear. You have an envelopment maneuver coming from the south rim. Shift your fire to the 220, elevation 40 degrees. They are using the cave overhangs for suppression." "Who the hell is this?" A voice crackled back. It was Sergeant First Class Holloway, the platoon sergeant. "It's Vance. I'm looking at their heat signatures through the limestone. The rock is thin there. If you use the Mark 19, you can collapse the overhang. Do it now, or you're going to be flanked in 90 seconds. There was a pause, a moment of hesitation that felt like an eternity, and then the heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the 40mm grenade launcher began to echo through the canyon. On her screen, Elena watched the thermal bloom of the explosions. The limestone overhang, weakened by the very charges the enemy had used to start the ambush, gave way. A secondary rock slide roared down, this time burying the enemy positions on the south rim. The screaming on the radio didn't stop, but the rhythm of it changed. It went from the sound of a slaughter to the sound of a fight. Kalen pushed the Humvee forward, the heavy vehicle bouncing over the uneven ground as they neared the mouth of the canyon. The dust was so thick it was like driving through a gray soup, but Elena didn't need her eyes. She had the sensors. She had the hum. She could feel the weight of the mountain above them, the precarious balance of the rocks, the hidden pockets of air where men were still breathing. "Stop here," she commanded. Kalen slammed on the brakes. "We're still 200 yards out. Sergeant, we need to get to the line." "No," Elena said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at a specific spike on her monitor. "There's a secondary vibration, right under the roadbed." She opened the door and stepped out into the chaos. The sound was deafening now, the sharp, metallic crack of small arms fire reflecting off the canyon walls, the roar of the fire, the shouting. But she tuned it all out. She knelt on the ground, pressing her gloved hand against the cold, vibrating earth. She wasn't looking for a sound anymore. She was looking for a heartbeat, not a human one, a mechanical one. "A pressure plate," she whispered. "A big one, designed for a heavy vehicle." She looked up at the dust-choked entrance to the canyon. If they had driven another 20 feet, the Humvee would have been a funeral pyre. She stood up, her face covered in a fine layer of white limestone dust, making her look like a ghost herself. She didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, hard clarity. This was what she was built for. This was why she had spent her life listening to the things no one else cared about. "Kalen," she shouted over the roar of a passing jet, "get the winch cable out. We're not going over it. We're going to pull the trigger from here." As Kalen scrambled out of the truck, Elena looked back at the canyon. Through the dust, she saw a figure stumbling toward them. It was Miller. His helmet was gone, his face was a mask of blood and soot, and he was clutching his shoulder, but he was alive. He stopped 10 feet away, staring at her, staring at the Humvee that had stopped exactly where it needed to. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence between them was the loudest thing in the valley. Elena didn't wait for his apology or his acknowledgement. She turned her back on him and reached for her laptop. There were still 48 men in that canyon, and the mountain was still talking. She was the only one who knew how to translate what it was saying before it was too late. The air around Elena felt like it was made of static and pulverized stone. She ignored Captain Miller's shattered expression, turning her focus back to the ruggedized screen. The battle wasn't a singular event anymore. It had fractured into a dozen small, desperate survivals. On her thermal overlay, she could see the heat signatures of Alpha Company scattered like glowing embers. Some were stationary, too stationary. Others were moving in erratic bursts, trying to find cover that wasn't there. Miller stumbled toward the Humvee, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. He reached out a hand, grasping the door frame for support, his blood leaving a dark, smeared handprint on the desert tan paint. Vance, he rasped, the word barely surviving the dry heat of his throat. Vance, I didn't see it. Elena didn't look up. She couldn't afford to. The ghost frequency she had been tracking wasn't just a single idol anymore. It had multiplied. It was a network. I told you to stay off the net, Captain, she said, her voice devoid of malice, sounding instead like a recording of a fact. You should have listened to the silence instead of your clock. She tapped a command into the keyboard, narrowing the acoustic filters. The sound of the firefight began to drop away in her headset, replaced by the amplified, subterranean groans of the canyon itself. The mountain was shifting. The initial explosions hadn't just triggered a rock slide, they had compromised the structural integrity of the entire drainage basin. Holloway, she shouted into the radio, her voice cutting through the sergeant's frantic report of casualties. Holloway, get everyone away from the north wall. Now, the shale is liquefying. You've got a secondary collapse coming in less than 2 minutes. Vance, we're pinned. Holloway's voice was a scream over the sound of incoming rounds. If we move, we're in the open. We've got 3 men down we can't reach. If you stay there, you're buried, Elena countered, her eyes scanning a rapidly rising line on her graph. The vibration is hitting the resonance frequency of the upper shelf. It's coming down, Sergeant. Move to the center of the wash. Use the wrecks for cover. Just get away from the wall. She didn't wait for a reply. She turned to Kaylin, who was struggling with the winch cable near the front bumper. Forget the cable, Kaylin. Get back in. We need the LRAD. The long-range acoustic device was a dish-mounted speaker on the roof, usually used for crowd control or broadcasting warnings. But Elena knew its secondary capabilities. She knew that sound, at the right frequency and the right volume, wasn't just a warning. It was a physical force. What are you doing? Miller asked, his voice shaking. I'm going to give them a reason to keep their heads down, Elena said, and I'm going to try to trigger that shelf before our men are under it. She climbed into the passenger seat, her fingers dancing across a specialized interface she'd spent months tweaking in her spare time back at Carson. Most operators used the LRAD as a megaphone. Elena used it as a weapon. She set the frequency to a low-end pulse, a hertz level that resonated with human equilibrium and the brittle, crystalline structure of the limestone. Kaylin, on my mark, you're going to floor it in reverse, she said. I'm going to fire a concentrated burst at the ridgeline. The kickback on the power draw might stall the engine. If it does, we're sitting ducks for those snipers. I got you, Sarge, Kaylin said, his face pale but his hands steady. Miller watched them, his authority a discarded thing in the dirt. He was a spectator to a war he thought he understood, watching a woman he had dismissed as a sensor attachment prepare to play the mountain like an instrument. Elena took a breath, held it, and hit the trigger. The sound wasn't a roar. It was a punch to the chest, a physical wave of pressure that distorted the air in front of the Humvee, ripple effecting through the dust. On the ridgeline, the enemy fighters who had been lining up their shots suddenly clutched their ears, their rifles dropping as their inner ears were hammered by a frequency that bypassed the ear canal and vibrated the brain directly against the skull. At the same time, the pulse hit the weakened limestone shelf. It was the final, rhythmic push the mountain couldn't withstand. With a sound like a giant bone snapping, a 10-ton slab of rock sheared off the north wall, falling exactly where Elena had predicted. It didn't hit the soldiers. They had scrambled into the wash, shielded by the smoking remains of a destroyed transport truck. Instead, it fell onto the enemy's primary flanking route, sealing the cave entrance they were using to cycle fresh fighters into the ambush. The Humvee's engine sputtered, the lights on the dashboard flickering as the LRAD drained the battery, but Kaylin had already thrown it into gear, the tires spinning and spitting gravel as he hauled them back 50 yards. The silence that followed was heavy and ringing. The enemy fire had stopped. The dust began to settle, coating the world in a gray, ghostly shroud. Elena sat in the seat, her chest heaving, the controlled part of her control finally fraying at the edges. Her hands were shaking now. She could feel the cost of the last 10 minutes, the mental strain of processing 1,000 data points, the physical toll of the acoustic pulse, the sheer, raw weight of the lives she was holding in her head. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at her hands. "You saved them," Miller whispered. He was sitting on the ground outside the door, his head in his hands. "You told me, and I didn't listen." Elena looked at him then. Her eyes weren't cold anymore. They were tired. They were the eyes of a woman who had seen the end of the world and was the only one left to describe it. "It wasn't about being right, Captain," she said softly. "It was about the fact that the mountain doesn't care about your mission clock. It only cares about gravity." She climbed out of the truck, her boots crunching on the shale. The sun was finally beginning to crest the horizon, bleeding a bruised purple and orange light over the rim of the canyon. In the distance, she could see the first of the men emerging from the wash, leaning on each other, covered in the gray dust that made them look like statues come to life. Holloway was leading them, his face a mask of exhaustion. He stopped when he saw the Humvee, his eyes finding Elena. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, a slow, deep acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid in words. Elena didn't nod back. She couldn't. She was already looking past them, toward the higher peaks. The sensors in her ears were still picking up something. A faint, rhythmic tapping, not from the canyon. From the valley beyond, the mission wasn't over. The threat hadn't vanished, it had just shifted its frequency. "Sergeant?" Kaylin asked, walking up beside her. "What is it? What do you hear?" Elena didn't answer. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of limestone she'd picked up back at the base. She turned it over in her hand, feeling the sharp edges, the ancient weight of it. "I hear a countdown," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost lost to the wind, "and we're already at 0. She looked at the radio on her hip. It was silent, but in her head, the hum was growing louder, a deep, resonant thrumming that felt like it was coming from the very core of the earth. She knew that sound. She'd heard it once before, in a textbook at Huachuca, described in a classified file about tectonic scale engineering. It wasn't a trap for 50 men, she realized, the blood draining from her face as the full shape of the threat finally emerged. The canyon ambush was the distraction. The real play was the dam 10 miles upstream. And if the frequency she was hearing was what she thought it was, the mechanical idol hadn't been a generator. It had been a vibration induction system designed to liquefy the base of the dam. "Captain," Elena said, her voice sharp and commanding, snapping Miller out of his shock. "Get on the horn to division. Tell them to evacuate the entire basin. Tell them the Black River Dam is going to fail in 20 minutes. Miller looked at her, his brow furrowing. "Vance, what are you talking about? The dam is reinforced concrete. It's built to withstand a tactical nuke." "It's not built to withstand resonance," Elena said, already moving back toward the Humvee, her mind racing. "They're not blowing it up. They're singing it to death. And we're the only ones close enough to stop the song." She didn't wait for him to agree. She didn't wait for an order. She climbed into the driver's seat this time, shoving her laptop into Kaylin's hands. "Drive, Sarge?" Kaylin asked, his voice cracking. "No," Elena said, slamming the vehicle into gear. "We're flying." As the Humvee roared toward the service road that led to the high ground, Elena Vance wasn't a sergeant anymore. She wasn't an attachment. She was a woman who had spent her life listening to the secrets of the world, and for the first time, she was going to scream back. The service road was a ribbon of broken asphalt and packed dirt that hugged the spine of the ridge, winding upward toward the monolithic shadow of the Black River Dam. Behind them, the canyon was a smoking wound in the earth, the survivors of Alpha Company's small, dark dots against the gray shale. Elena drove with a focused, surgical intensity, her eyes darting between the narrow track and the acoustic monitors strapped to the dash. The Humvee groaned, its suspension protesting as she took the turns at a speed the manual explicitly forbade. Beside her, Kaylin was white-knuckled, staring at the laptop screen. "Sergeant, the signal." "It's changing," he said, his voice trembling as the vehicle lurched over a deep rut. "The amplitude is spiking. It's hitting the 15 hertz mark." Elena nodded, her jaw locked. 15 hertz. The frequency of fear. The frequency that made human eyes vibrate in their sockets, creating hallucinations of gray shapes in the periphery. But more importantly, it was the frequency that could turn the compacted earth of a dam's foundation into something with the consistency of quicksand. "They're using the old mining shafts," she muttered, more to herself than to Kaylin. "The valley is honeycombed with them. They've dropped the induction units into the deep vents. It's using the entire mountain as a sounding board." She reached for the PRC 117 radio, the long-range unit that could reach Division HQ. "This is Staff Sergeant Vance, Lead Sensor Element, Alpha Company. Authenticate Alpha Tango 9er. I have a Category 1 environmental threat at the Black River Dam. Total structural failure imminent. We have a resonance induction attack in progress." There was a long beat of static, the kind of silence that usually preceded a board corporal asking for a repeat. Then, a voice came through, not a corporal, but a woman with the crisp, no-nonsense accent of a career officer at division. "Sergeant Vance, this is Colonel Shepard at TOC. We're seeing your bio data on the net. You're at a high-stress heart rate. Explain resonance induction attack. Our sensors show no seismic activity and no explosives." "Because they're not using explosives, Colonel," Elena shouted over the roar of the wind through the cracked windshield. "They're using low-frequency sound. It doesn't show up on standard seismic sensors because the wavelength is too long. It's below the threshold of your equipment, but it's exactly at the threshold of the dam's foundation. In 15 minutes, that concrete is going to be sitting on a puddle of mud." Shepard's voice didn't waver, but there was a pause. "Vance, I have engineers here saying that's physically impossible without a massive power source. Where would they get the juice?" "The mining substation," Elena said, her eyes narrowing as she saw the dam's massive face loom into view. "It's 5 miles from here. They hijacked the grid 10 hours ago. I called it in. I reported the power surge at 2200 last night and was told it was a faulty transformer." The radio went silent again. Elena knew what was happening on the other end. They were looking at the logs. They were realizing that the ghost hunter had been right about the power surge, just like she'd been right about the canyon. "Vance," Shepard's voice was back, and this time the boredom was gone. It was replaced by a cold, sharp urgency. "We can't get a bird in the air fast enough to interdict. The nearest QRF is 30 minutes out. What can you do?" "I'm 3 minutes from the dam's crest," Elena said, her voice leveling out as she entered the dark competence zone. "I have an LRAD 1000 and a high-gain signal processor. If I can find the primary induction vent, I can fire a counter-frequency. I can cancel the wave." "That's a theoretical application, Vance," Shepard said. "It's never been done in the field." "Then today is a good day for a field test," Colonel Elena replied. She slammed the Humvee to a halt at the edge of the dam's massive concrete apron. The air here felt different. It was heavy, a thick, nauseating pressure that made her stomach churn. It was the sound you couldn't hear but could feel in your marrow. The concrete under her boots was humming, a deep, rhythmic throb that felt like a dying heart. "Kaylin, get the tripod," she shouted, leaping out of the vehicle. The dam was a wall of gray, 200 feet of engineering that held back 1 billion gallons of water. If it went, the valley below, the villages, the base, the 50 men she'd just saved, would be erased in a matter of minutes. She looked at the laptop. The signal was a jagged mountain range of green lines. She needed to find the exact phase of the incoming wave. If she was off by even a fraction of a degree, her counterpulse wouldn't cancel the threat. It would amplify it. It would be the hammer that broke the glass. She closed her eyes, letting the world fall away. She ignored the wind, the smell of the water, the distant sound of Miller's voice over the radio. She focused on the vibration in her feet. She let her father's lessons take over, the machinist's daughter, listening for the 1,000th of an inch. "It's not a single source," she whispered. "It's a triplet. 3 units out of phase. They're trying to create a vortex," she realized. "A circular vibration that will drill right through the bedrock." "Kaylin, set the LRAD to a sweeping 12 to 18 Hz pulse. I need to map the return echo." She was working in the dark, using sound to see the invisible. She fired a burst from the LRAD. The massive dish on the roof of the Humvee let out a visible ripple in the air. She watched the screen as the return signal mapped the subterranean vents. "There," she said, pointing to a small, unassuming maintenance hatch near the base of the spillway. The vent leads straight to the old mining tunnels. That's where they dropped the units. She grabbed a heavy Pelican case from the back of the truck, her own gear, stuff she'd bought with her own money and modified in the hobby shop at Carson. It was a digital signal generator capable of extreme precision. "I have to go down there," she said. "Sarge, no," Kaylin said, looking at the hatch. "If that dam starts to go while you're inside, then I'll be the first to know," Elena said. She looked at Miller, who had just pulled up in a second vehicle, his face still pale, his arm in a sling. He looked at the hatch, then at the massive wall of concrete above them. He didn't try to stop her this time. He didn't tell her to stay in the truck. He walked over to her, his movements slow and painful. He reached into his vest and pulled out a heavy black thermite grenade. "If you can't cancel it," he said, his voice a rasp, "drop this into the vent. It'll slag the induction units, but it'll also seal the tunnel. You won't have time to get out." Elena took the grenade, its weight a cold promise in her hand. "I'll keep that in mind, Captain." She turned to the hatch, her heart rate steadying. This was the moment. The hidden capability, the extraordinary gift that had made her an outcast, was now the only thing that mattered. She wasn't just a sergeant. She wasn't just a woman in a man's world. She was the only person on the planet who could hear the mountain's heartbeat and knew how to stop it. She pulled the lever on the hatch and descended into the dark, the sound of the world above fading, replaced by the roar of the water and the deep, terrifying song of the machines in the deep. The air inside the maintenance shaft was thick with the smell of wet limestone and ozone. As Elena descended the rusted iron ladder, the vibration changed from a hum to a physical assault. It felt like the air itself was trying to shake the teeth out of her skull. She kept her headlamp focused on the wall, watching the way the moisture-beaded rock seemed to dance in the light. She reached the bottom, a narrow, concrete-lined tunnel that smelled of 50 years of neglect. The sound here was a low, rhythmic thudding, like a massive drum being beaten deep underground. Thump, thump, thump. Each beat felt like a blow to her solar plexus. She opened the Pelican case, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 hours of practice. She connected the signal generator to a portable amplifier and a high-output transducer. This wasn't a precision instrument like the LRAD. This was a crude, powerful tool. She needed to find the primary resonance point of the tunnel itself and use it as a megaphone. She moved deeper into the dark, her boots splashing through an inch of standing water. The vibration was so intense now that her vision began to blur. She could feel her heart trying to sync with the rhythm of the machines, a dangerous, physiological phenomenon called entrainment. If she stayed here too long, the frequency would stop her heart. She stopped at a junction where 3 mining shafts met. This was the sweet spot, the acoustic center. She knelt in the water, her hands trembling as she adjusted the dials on the generator. She could hear the induction units now. They were close, hidden behind a thin wall of rock in the next shaft over. They were singing a song of destruction, a perfect, mathematical sequence designed to shatter the world. She closed her eyes and listened. She didn't look at the screen. She didn't need the data anymore. She could feel the phase of the wave in her bones. It was a 14, 2 Hz pulse with a secondary harmonic at 28, 4. She dialed the generator to 14, 2, but she inverted the phase. She was creating the anti-sound. She hit the power toggle. For a second, nothing happened. Then the 2 waves met. The sound didn't get louder. It got quieter. It was an eerie, unnatural silence that felt more violent than the noise. The 2 frequencies fought each other in the air, canceling each other out, creating a pocket of dead space. On the surface, the concrete of the dam stopped humming. Elena breathed out, a jagged, sobbing breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was working. The resonance was collapsing. But then, the floor beneath her feet buckled. The anti-sound was canceling the vibration in the air, but the damage to the foundation had already been done. The rock was already unstable. A secondary tremor, a natural settling of the earth, rippled through the shaft. A section of the ceiling collapsed 20 feet behind her, sealing the way back to the ladder. Elena didn't panic. She didn't scream. She looked at the generator. The lights were flickering. The transducer was overheating. She was holding the dam together with a battery and a prayer, and she was trapped in a tomb of her own making. She reached for her radio. "Kaylin, do you copy?" Static. The rock was too thick. She looked at the thermite grenade Miller had given her. She could end it. She could slag the machines and make sure the dam held, even if it meant she never walked out of this tunnel. She thought about Sandusky. She thought about the snow on the roof and her father's hands on the lathe. She thought about the 50 men in the canyon who were currently breathing because she had noticed a bird didn't sing. She reached for the generator, turning the dial up. She wasn't just going to cancel the wave. She was going to shatter the induction units with a feedback loop. It was a one-way trip for the hardware. She dialed the frequency higher, pushing the transducer past its breaking point. A high-pitched whine began to fill the tunnel, a sound like 1,000 sirens. The induction units responded. The machines in the next shaft began to scream as the feedback loop hit them. The vibration intensified, the rock walls around Elena beginning to crack and weep water. She gripped the handle of the generator, her eyes fixed on the red overload light. "Come on," she whispered. "Just a little more." With a final, catastrophic screech of tearing metal, the induction units in the next shaft exploded. The sound was a dull, muffled thud, followed by the sweet, blessed silence of a machine that had finally died. The vibration stopped. The world was still. Elena sat in the dark, the only light coming from her dimming headlamp. She was buried under 60 feet of rock and concrete, her equipment was slagged, and her radio was dead. She leaned her back against the cold, wet wall and closed her eyes. She had saved the dam. She had saved the valley. She felt a strange, quiet peace. She had done the thing she was built for. She had listened and she had answered. A few minutes later, or maybe it was hours, she heard something. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't the mountain. It was a rhythmic, scraping sound. Thump, scrape, thump. It was the sound of a shovel hitting shale. She opened her eyes. The sound was coming from the collapse behind her. "Vance," a voice shouted, muffled and distant but unmistakable. "Vance, if you're in there, you better be alive or I'm going to court-martial your ghost." It was Miller. Elena felt a small, tired smile touch her lips. She reached out and grabbed a piece of rock, tapping it against the wall in a steady, 3-beat rhythm. "I'm here, Captain," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her yet. "I'm just waiting for my ride." She sat there in the dark, listening to the sound of men digging, the sound of her own heartbeat, and the beautiful, perfect silence of a world that was no longer screaming. She had been right. She had been dismissed. She had been betrayed by the very people she served. But as the first light of a headlamp broke through the dust of the collapsed tunnel, Elena Vance knew one thing for certain. The mountain might have the power, but she had the song. And she was the one still standing when the music stopped. The first sliver of light that cut through the darkness of the tunnel wasn't the sun. It was the sharp, blue-white beam of a tactical flashlight. It danced across the ceiling, illuminating the dust motes that hung in the air like tiny, suspended diamonds. Elena didn't move. She stayed leaned against the damp rock, her breathing shallow and rhythmic, conserving the thinning oxygen. She watched the light grow stronger, heard the frantic, metallic scrape of folding shovels against the shale. "Vance," that was Holloway's voice now, booming and rough, a sound that had been honed by 20 years of yelling over the roar of diesel engines and the crack of small arms fire. "Sergeant Vance, talk to me." Elena reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, dead casing of her signal generator. She found a heavy wrench in her tool kit and struck the concrete wall. 3 sharp clangs. A pause, 3 more. "She's alive." Kaylin's voice, cracked with a mix of relief and exhaustion, echoed through the gap. "Keep digging. Watch that overhead slab." The next 20 minutes were a symphony of organized chaos. Elena listened to them, the specific, rhythmic grunts of men working in a confined space, the clatter of rocks being passed back in a bucket brigade, the hissed commands of Miller, who was clearly ignoring his medic's orders to stay back. She could tell exactly how many of them were digging by the cadence of their breathing. 7 men. They were working in shifts of 3, rotating every 5 minutes to keep the pace up. Finally, the gap widened enough for a hand to reach through, a gloved hand, covered in gray limestone dust. Elena took it. The grip was iron-tight, pulling her forward as the last of the rubble was cleared. She scrambled through the hole, her lungs burning as she hit the fresher air of the main shaft. Strong arms caught her, steadying her as her legs threatened to give way. She blinked against the glare of half a dozen flashlights, her eyes stinging. "You look like hell," Sergeant Miller said. He was standing right in front of her, his arm now in a proper sling, his face cleaned of blood but etched with a deep, permanent shadow of regret. Elena wiped a layer of silt from her forehead, her gaze leveling on him. "I told you it was 15 hertz, Captain. You owe me a new signal generator." Miller let out a short, dry laugh that turned into a wince. "I think we can find room in the budget for that, along with a few other things." They moved back up the shaft, the men of Alpha Company forming a corridor of silent, dusty figures. As Elena passed them, they didn't look at her with the polite indifference they'd shown for the last 6 months. They looked at her the way soldiers look at a lucky charm they've just realized is actually a weapon. Holloway walked beside her, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of respect that felt heavier than any metal. Emerging from the maintenance hatch was like stepping into another world. The sun was fully up now, bathing the Black River Dam in a brilliant, unforgiving gold. The water of the reservoir was calm, a vast sheet of blue glass that showed no hint of the catastrophe it had nearly become. In the distance, the sky was filled with the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of heavy-lift helicopters. The QRF had arrived, along with a fleet of engineering birds and a command ship that was already circling the dam like a worried hawk. "Colonel Shepard wants to see you," Miller said, gesturing toward a Blackhawk that was banking toward the landing pad. "Personally. She's already seen the sensor logs you uploaded before the tunnel collapsed. The Pentagon is already asking questions about acoustic warfare that nobody knows how to answer." Elena looked at the helicopter, then back at the canyon where the smoke was finally beginning to clear. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss, not for the equipment, but for the anonymity she'd just traded away. She had spent her life being the one who listened, the one who saw the patterns in the noise while remaining part of the noise herself. That was over now. "Sergeant?" Kalen asked, standing by the Humvee. He was holding her thermal mug. It was dented and covered in dust, but he'd filled it with fresh coffee from the command tent. "We going?" Elena took the mug, the heat of it seeping into her cold fingers. She looked at the dam, then at the men around her, the 50 men who were standing on solid ground because she'd refused to stay in the truck. She took a slow, deliberate sip of the coffee. It was still bitter. It still tasted like plastic. "Not yet, Kalen," she said, her voice regaining that calm, level anchor. She turned to Miller, her eyes sharp. "We have 3 more induction signatures on the long-range sweep. They're faint, but they are there. South of the ridge, near the old pump station." Miller's face went hard. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't ask for a second opinion. He just reached for his radio. "All Alpha elements, gear up," he barked. "We have secondary objectives." Sergeant Vance has the lead. He looked at Elena, a silent question in his eyes. Elena didn't say a word. She walked to the Humvee, climbed into the passenger seat, and opened her laptop. The screen flickered to life, showing a new set of green lines, a new mountain range of data. She adjusted her headset, tuning out the sound of the helicopters, the shouting, and the wind. She closed her eyes and listened. The world was still talking, and this time, everyone was listening. The vibration of the Humvee's engine was a different kind of violence than the one Elena Vance had just left behind in the tunnel. It was a chaotic, unrefined thrum, a mechanical heartbeat that felt clumsy compared to the lethal precision of the induction units. She sat in the passenger seat, her head resting against the cool glass of the window, watching the jagged landscape of the high desert blur into a smear of ochre and shadow. The tinnitus in her ears was a steady, high-pitched whine, a silver needle of sound that refused to let her find a moment of true silence. She didn't look at Captain Miller, who was gripping the steering wheel of the lead vehicle with a white-knuckled intensity that spoke of a man trying to outrun his own shame. He hadn't spoken since they'd pulled her from the rubble, and Elena didn't need him to. She could hear the way his breath caught in his throat every time they hit a bump. The sound of a man who was acutely aware of how close he'd come to leading 50 men into a mass grave. Specialist Kalen sat in the back, the ruggedized laptop open on his knees. He was tapping at the keys, his movements hesitant, as if he was afraid the machine might break if he pushed it too hard. "Sergeant?" he said, his voice barely a whisper over the roar of the diesel engine. The gain on the southern array is fluctuating. It's not a steady pulse anymore. It's wandering. Elena didn't open her eyes. She didn't need to see the screen to know what Kaylin was looking at. The 3 signatures she'd picked up were no longer stationary. They were moving in a synchronized pattern, a slow, deliberate sweep of the valley's southern floor. "They're not looking for another dam, Kaylin," she said, her voice sounding thin and metallic to her own ears. "They're looking for the fault line. They're trying to find the point where the bedrock is the thinnest." "Where does that lead?" Miller asked, his voice rough. Elena finally opened her eyes and looked at the map on the dashboard. "It leads to the aquifer," she said. "If they hit the resonance frequency of the subterranean water table, they don't need to collapse a dam. They can liquefy the soil for 50 square miles. The entire valley floor will turn into a marsh in less than 10 seconds. Everything built on it, the base, the town of Oakhaven, the highway, it all just sinks." Miller's jaw tightened. "We're 20 minutes out from the FOB. I'll get the colonel on the line as soon as we're within range of the high-gain antenna." "We don't have 20 minutes, Elena said. She reached out and took the laptop from Kaylin, her fingers flying across the keys with a speed that came from years of operating in the dark. She bypassed the standard military interface, diving into the raw acoustic data she'd been harvesting since they left the dam. The 3 signatures were converging on a point near the old pump station, a derelict facility that hadn't seen a drop of water in 20 years. It was a place the locals called the Devil's Thumb, a lone pillar of rock that stood over the deepest part of the aquifer. The forward operating base, known officially as FOB Ironside, appeared on the horizon like a collection of tan Lego blocks dropped into a sandbox. It was a sprawling maze of HESCO barriers, razor wire, and sun-bleached tents, all centered around a reinforced concrete command center that had once been a regional airport terminal. As the Humvee approached the main gate, the guards didn't bother with the usual ritual of checking IDs. They saw the blood on Miller's uniform and the dust-choked silhouette of the vehicle, and waved them through with a grim urgency. The air inside the FOB was thick with the smell of JP-8 fuel, burned trash, and the metallic tang of an institution in the middle of a nervous breakdown. Men were running between tents, carrying crates of ammunition and medical supplies, while the distant roar of fighter jets taking off from the nearby airbase provided a constant, jarring soundtrack. Miller pulled the Humvee to a stop in front of the Tactical Operations Center TOC. "Stay here," he said to Elena, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'll talk to the colonel. You need to get to the med tent. You've got a concussion, Vance. I can see it in your eyes." "I'm fine," Elena said, already stepping out of the vehicle. The weight of her gear felt different now, no longer a burden but a part of her, a protective shell that she wasn't ready to shed. "I'm going with you." Miller looked like he wanted to argue, but then he saw the set of her shoulders and the cold, flat look in her eyes. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement, and led the way into the TOC. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of ozone and stale coffee. Large plasma screens lined the walls, showing satellite imagery, drone feeds, and a confusing array of tactical maps. In the center of the room stood Colonel Shepard, a woman whose face looked like it had been carved out of the same limestone that made up the canyon walls. She was surrounded by a group of men in crisp, clean uniforms, the specialists from Virginia who had arrived on the last transport. "Colonel," Miller said, coming to a halt and offering a sharp salute. "Captain Miller, Alpha Company. This is Staff Sergeant Vance." Shepard didn't look up from the map she was studying. "I know who you are, Miller, and I know what happened at the dam. I've spent the last hour on the phone with the Pentagon explaining why a sensor attachment was the only person who knew the mountain was falling down." She finally looked at Elena, her eyes narrowing. "Sergeant Vance, you've had a busy morning." "I have new data," Colonel, Elena said, stepping forward. She didn't wait for an invitation. She set the laptop down on the main planning table, shoving a stack of folders aside to make room. "The signatures I picked up at the dam have moved. They're converging on the Devil's Thumb. They're going after the aquifer." One of the men from Virginia, a major with a pristine haircut and a chest full of ribbons that looked like they'd never seen a day of dirt, let out a soft, condescending chuckle. Sergeant, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but we've had the KH-11 satellite overhead for the last 30 minutes. There is no movement at the pump station. No vehicles, no personnel, no heat signatures. Whatever you think you're hearing, it's not an active threat. Elena didn't blink. She didn't look at the major. She looked at Shepard. Satellite imagery doesn't see sound, Colonel. These units are buried. They're using the old irrigation pipes as waveguides. They don't need a heat signature if they're drawing power directly from the substation grid through the underground lines. Major Higgins is our primary intelligence analyst for this theater, Sergeant, Shepard said, her voice neutral. He's telling me the area is clear. The area is not clear, Elena countered. Her voice was calm, but there was a vibration in it, a low-frequency intensity that made the coffee in a nearby mug ripple. Major Higgins is looking for a conventional enemy. He's looking for boots and tires. This isn't a conventional attack. It's an environmental destabilization. If you don't put boots on the ground at that pump station in the next hour, this entire base is going to be underwater. Vance, that's enough, Miller whispered, reaching out to touch her arm. Elena shook him off. She leaned over the table, her eyes locked on Shepard's. You sent 50 men into a canyon this morning because you didn't trust the data. Don't do it again. The room went silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the distant, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter. Major Higgins looked like he'd been slapped. Colonel, this is insubordination, he said, his voice tight. This NCO is clearly suffering from combat stress. She should be removed from the TOC immediately. Shepard didn't answer. She looked at Elena for a long time, as if she were trying to see the frequency Elena was describing. Then she looked at Miller. Captain, what's your assessment? Miller took a breath. He looked at the major, then at the map, and finally at Elena. My assessment, Colonel, is that Sergeant Vance has been right about every single thing that has happened in the last 12 hours. If she says the ground is about to turn into liquid, I'm inclined to believe her. Shepard turned back to the map. Even if I wanted to send a team, I don't have the assets. The QRF is still at the dam, and the rest of the battalion is stretched thin across the northern perimeter. I can't move a platoon on a maybe. Then give me a vehicle and a driver, Elena said, and a radio. You're not going out there alone, Sergeant, Shepard said. I'll go with her, Miller said, and I'll take Kalen and Holloway. We're already dirty. A little more dust won't hurt us. Shepard looked at the major, who was visibly seething, and then back at Miller. You have 1 hour, Captain. If you don't find anything, you get your asses back here and Sergeant Vance goes straight to the psych ward. Am I clear? Crystal, Colonel, Miller said. They walked out of the TOC, the air outside feeling even hotter than it had 10 minutes ago. Miller didn't say anything as they headed back toward the Humvee. He just climbed into the driver's seat and waited for Elena to get in. You didn't have to do that, Elena said as they pulled away from the command center. Yes, I did, Miller said. Not for you. For me. I'm tired of being the man who didn't listen. They picked up Holloway near the armory. He was leaning against a stack of ammo crates, his SAW gunner's vest cinched tight, a look of grim satisfaction on his face when he saw them. Heard we're going ghost hunting again, he said, climbing into the back next to Kalen. We're going to the pump station, Miller said. Vance thinks they're trying to sink the valley. Holloway nodded, checking the action on his M4. Sounds about right for this week. Let's get moving before the ground gets soft. The drive to the Devil's Thumb took them across a landscape that felt increasingly alien. The sand was a deep, burnt orange, and the scrub brush was skeletal and gray. As they moved further south, the vibration began to return. It wasn't something Elena heard. It was something she felt in her teeth, a dull, aching resonance that seemed to be coming from the very air itself. She opened the laptop, her eyes tracking the signal. It was stronger now, a localized spike that was centered exactly on the pump station. But there was something else, a secondary frequency, a high-pitched oscillation that was weaving in and out of the primary pulse. They're tuning it, she muttered. What? Kalen asked, leaning forward. They're not just hitting the bedrock anymore, Elena said. They're using the secondary frequency to create a standing wave. It's like they're trying to find the exact resonant frequency of the water itself. If they hit it, the water will expand. It'll blow the aquifer apart from the inside. The pump station came into view, a cluster of rusted metal buildings and concrete tanks huddled at the base of the Devil's Thumb. It looked exactly as the Major had described, abandoned, silent, and dead. There were no tracks in the sand, no smoke from generators, no signs of life. Miller slowed the Humvee to a crawl, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "See anything?" he asked Holloway. "Nothing but rust and rattlesnakes," Holloway replied. Elena didn't look at the buildings. She looked at the ground. She could see it now, the way the sand was subtly shifting, tiny grains dancing in a rhythmic pattern that had nothing to do with the wind. It was the same pattern she'd seen in a physics lab back in college, the way sand on a vibrating plate forms complex geometric shapes. "Stop the truck," she said. Miller hit the brakes. "Why?" "The ground is already starting to liquefy," Elena said. "If we drive any further, we're going to sink." She stepped out of the vehicle, her boots sinking an inch into the sand. It felt like walking on a mattress. The vibration was a roar in her ears now, a physical pressure that made her dizzy. She grabbed the signal processor and the transducer from the back of the truck, her movements slow and deliberate. "I need to find the primary waveguide," she said to Miller. "It'll be the pipe with the highest vibration." Holloway and Kalin followed her, their weapons at the ready, though there was no one to shoot at. The pump station was a graveyard of industrial equipment, the air thick with the smell of stagnant water and old oil. Elena moved between the tanks, her hand skimming the surface of the rusted pipes. She found it near the main intake valve. The pipe was vibrating so hard it was a blur to the eye. It was emitting a low, mournful hum that seemed to vibrate the very air around it. "Here," she said. She knelt by the pipe, her fingers tracing the metal. It wasn't just a pipe, it was a conduit. The induction unit was somewhere deep underground, connected to this pipe by a series of couplings. "I can't cancel this one from the surface," she said, her voice shaking with the intensity of the vibration. "The wave is too complex. I need to get into the wet well." The wet well was a 30-foot deep concrete pit that sat beneath the pump station, designed to collect water before it was pumped into the tanks. It was a dark, damp hole that smelled of a century of decay. Miller looked at the pit, then at Elena. "You're not going down there alone." "I have to," Elena said. "The transducer needs to be in direct contact with the water. If I fire it from here, the concrete will just absorb the energy." She didn't wait for his permission. She grabbed a rope from her kit and secured it to a nearby support beam. She didn't look back as she lowered herself into the dark, the sound of the world above fading into a rhythmic, subterranean throb. The bottom of the wet well was covered in a foot of oily, black water. The walls were slick with algae, and the air was so thick it felt like trying to breathe through a wet towel. Elena set the transducer down in the water, her hands moving with a cold, mechanical grace. She connected the cables to the signal generator, her eyes fixed on the screen of her handheld monitor. The wave was beautiful in its lethality. A perfect, cascading series of harmonics that was tearing the earth apart 30 feet below her. She began to dial in the counter-frequency, her fingers steady despite the fact that her entire body was vibrating. She could feel the water around her feet beginning to churn, tiny bubbles rising to the surface as the pressure in the aquifer reached the breaking point. "Come on," she whispered. "Just a little more." She hit the activate button. The transducer let out a low, powerful pulse that sent a ripple through the black water. For a second, the vibration seemed to lessen. The roar in her ears dropped an octave, and the pressure in her chest eased. But then, the high-pitched oscillation returned, stronger than before. Their counter-tuning, Elena realized, her heart hammering against her ribs. They have someone on the other end, monitoring the signal. They're adjusting the frequency in real time. She scrambled to adjust the settings, her mind racing. This wasn't a machine she was fighting anymore, it was a person. Someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Someone who was playing the same game she was. The water around her feet began to rise, not a slow, steady trickle, but a sudden, violent surge. The pressure in the aquifer was forcing the water up through the pipes, turning the wet well into a pressurized chamber. "Vance," Miller's voice echoed down from the hatch, sounding 1,000 miles away. "Get out of there. The ground is starting to give way. I'm not done," Elena shouted back, her voice lost in the roar of the rising water. She leaned over the signal generator, her eyes locked on the screen. She needed to find the dead spot, the one frequency that the induction unit couldn't compensate for. She scrolled through the spectrum, her fingers a blur. She found it, a narrow 3 Hz band that was shielded by the natural resonance of the devil's thumb. If she could hit that band with enough power, she could shatter the induction unit's coupling. But the transducer wasn't powerful enough. Not on its own. She looked at the wet well's primary intake pipe, a massive 30-inch iron tube that ran straight down into the earth. If she could use the pipe as an amplifier. She grabbed a roll of heavy-duty duct tape from her kit and began to strap the transducer directly to the pipe. Her hands were wet, the tape slipping, but she didn't stop. She could feel the water reaching her knees, then her waist. The pressure was so intense now that it felt like her skin was being peeled off. She finished the last wrap and hit the overload switch on the generator. The sound that followed wasn't a hum. It was a scream, a high-pitched, metallic shriek that tore through the wet well, reflecting off the concrete walls until it was a solid wall of noise. Elena was thrown back against the wall, the breath knocked out of her. She watched as the intake pipe began to glow with a dull, red heat, the metal groaning under the strain of the feedback loop. A second later, the pipe exploded. Not a fiery blast, but a clean structural failure. The metal sheared off, sending a geyser of pressurized water into the air. The vibration stopped instantly, the silence that followed so profound it felt like a physical blow. Elena lay in the water, her chest heaving, the controlled part of her control finally shattered. She was shaking, her eyes wide, the reality of what she'd just done beginning to sink in. She had won. She had broken the song. But as she looked up at the hatch, she didn't see Miller. She didn't see the light of the desert sun. She saw the shadow of a man. He was standing at the edge of the pit, looking down at her. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was wearing a simple, dark jacket, and he was holding something in his hand, a small, silver device that looked like a high-end tuning fork. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, his face a mask of cold, intellectual curiosity. Then he reached down and pulled the rope up, coiled it neatly, and walked away. Vance, Miller's voice was back, but it was further away now, joined by the sound of the Humvee's engine roaring to life. Vance, we have to go. Now. Elena tried to stand, but her legs were like water. She looked around the wet well, searching for another way out. There was none. The water was still rising, more slowly now, but steadily. She reached for her radio, but it was gone, lost in the black water. She was alone, in the dark, and the man with the silver device was still out there. She leaned her head against the wet concrete and closed her eyes. She had saved the valley, but she had lost the only thing that mattered. She was no longer a ghost hunter. She was the ghost. The water reached her chest, cold and indifferent. Elena didn't scream. She just waited, listening to the sound of the world above as it faded into a dull, distant throb. She had been right. And this was what it cost. The silence of the wet well was the most terrifying thing Elena had ever heard. It wasn't a natural silence. It was a vacuum, a hollow space where the world used to be. The geyser from the broken pipe had subsided into a gurgling trickle, and the water around her was now waist-deep, a black, oily mirror that reflected nothing. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, a slow, methodical numbing that started at her toes and worked its way up. She reached out, her fingers brushing the slick, algae-covered wall of the pit. The concrete was cracked, the seams leaking a fine, silty mud. The structural integrity of the pump station had been compromised by the resonance, and she could feel the weight of the earth above her pressing down, a slow, tectonic groan that vibrated in the soles of her feet. She looked up at the hatch. The shadow of the man was gone, replaced by the pale, dusty square of the sky. She tried to shout, but her throat was raw, the sound coming out as a dry, jagged rasp. Miller, Kalen, no answer, only the wind whistling across the mouth of the pit, a lonely, mournful sound that felt like a mockery. Elena didn't let herself panic. Panic was a frequency, a high-amplitude wave that disrupted the ability to think. She closed her eyes and forced her breathing into a slow, rhythmic pattern. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. She narrowed her focus, tuning out the cold, the dark, and the rising water, and concentrated on the sounds of the world above. She heard the Humvee. It wasn't driving away. It was idling about 50 yards from the pump station. She could hear the distinct, rhythmic clatter of the diesel engine, but there was something else: the sound of small arms fire. A sharp, metallic crack. Then another. A burst of automatic fire, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of Holloway's SAW. They weren't leaving her. They were pinned down. Elena's eyes snapped open. The man she'd seen at the hatch wasn't alone. He was part of a larger element, a team that had been waiting for them. The pump station hadn't just been a target, it had been an ambush. She looked at the broken pipe. It was a massive iron tube, but the section that had sheared off was only about 4 feet long. Below it, the main conduit still ran straight down into the earth, a dark, vertical tunnel that smelled of sulfur and ancient water. She looked at her Pelican case. It was half submerged, the electronics ruined, but the tools were still there. She reached in and pulled out a heavy-duty climbing harness and a coil of thin, high-tensile wire. It wasn't a rope, but it would have to do. She wasn't going up. She was going across. There was a secondary maintenance shaft about 10 feet up the wall, a narrow, corrugated metal tube that led to the pump house's basement. It was designed for electrical cables, not people, but it was her only chance. She tied the wire to the broken section of the pipe, her fingers numb and clumsy. She threw the other end toward the maintenance shaft, the wire whistling through the air. It missed. She tried again, and again. On the 4th try, the wire caught on a rusted bracket. She pulled it taut, testing the weight. It groaned, but it held. Elena began to climb, her boots slipping on the slick concrete. Every inch was a battle against gravity and her own exhaustion. Her muscles screamed, a dull, aching roar that matched the ringing in her ears. She didn't look down. She didn't look up. She just focused on the wire, the cold, thin line that was the only thing between her and the black water. She reached the shaft, her fingers grasping the jagged edge of the metal. She hauled herself in, the corrugated steel scraping against her vest, a sound like a giant file. The shaft was barely wide enough for her shoulders, and it was filled with the smell of dead rodents and old insulation. She crawled through the dark, the sounds of the battle above growing louder. She could hear Miller now, shouting commands, his voice tight with a desperate, controlled fury. Move to the flank. Kaylin, keep your head down. Elena reached the end of the shaft and pushed against a small, rusted grate. It gave way with a screeching protest, and she tumbled out onto a concrete floor. She was in the basement of the pump house. The air here was dry and tasted of dust. She stayed low, her hand going to the holster at her hip. Her M9 was there, the weight of it a small, familiar comfort. She checked the chamber, 1 in the pipe, 15 in the mag. She moved toward the stairs, her movements ghost quiet. She wasn't an infantryman, but she had spent enough time around them to know the rhythm of a room clearing. She paused at the top of the stairs, listening. 2 men, in the main room above. They weren't speaking. They were moving with a professional, economical grace, the sound of their boots on the floorboards a soft, rhythmic tapping. One was near the window, the other near the door. Elena took a breath, held it, and stepped into the room. The man by the window turned first. He was fast, faster than any insurgent she'd ever seen. He was wearing a gray tactical jacket and a headset, his rifle coming up in a smooth, practiced motion. Elena didn't hesitate. She fired twice, the rounds hitting him in the center of his chest. He went down without a sound, his rifle clattering to the floor. The second man, near the door, dived for cover behind a rusted tank. He returned fire, the rounds chewing into the wooden stairs behind Elena. She dropped to the floor, the smell of gunpowder and splinters filling the air. She didn't stay there. She rolled to the left, coming up behind a stack of old crates. She saw a flash of gray jacket. She fired once, the round catching him in the shoulder. He groaned, his fire faltering. Elena didn't wait. She charged, her shoulder hitting him in the chest, knocking him back against the wall. She jammed the muzzle of her M9 under his chin, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice a jagged edge of sound. The man didn't answer. He looked at her with a calm, almost bored expression, his eyes a cold, pale blue. Then, his jaw clenched, a small, clicking sound echoing in the room. Elena saw the foam at the corners of his mouth a second before his body went limp. Suicide pill. She backed away, her chest heaving. These weren't insurgents. They weren't mercenaries. They were something else entirely, something professional, something deep. She ran to the window and looked out. The Humvee was about 50 yards away, its windshield shattered, the tires shredded. Miller and Kalin were behind the vehicle, returning fire toward a cluster of rocks on the other side of the road. Holloway was about 20 yards to their left, his SAW suppressed, his position being chewed up by a sniper somewhere on the Devil's Thumb. Elena looked at the man she'd just killed. He had a high-end, suppressed rifle, a Barrett MRAD, the kind of weapon used by special operations units around the world. She picked it up. The optic was a night vision-capable Schmidt and Bender, a piece of glass that cost more than her car. She looked through the scope, the world turning a crisp, digital green. She found the sniper on the ridge. He was well hidden, tucked into a crevice in the rock, but the heat from his barrel was a glowing white-hot beacon in her optic. She adjusted the windage, her fingers moving with the same precision she used on her acoustic sensors. She wasn't a sniper, but the principles were the same: wind, distance, frequency. She took a breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared, a deep, concussive thumb that shook the pump house. On the ridge, the sniper's head snapped back, his body tumbling out of the crevice and down the rock face. Elena didn't wait to see him hit the ground. She shifted her fire to the rocks across the road. There were 3 more of them, moving in a flanking maneuver toward the Humvee. She fired 3 times, the heavy rounds punching through the rocks like they were made of cardboard. 2 of the men went down instantly. The third turned to run, but Elena caught him in the back, the round folding him in half. The fire from the rocks stopped. Miller and Kalin looked up, their eyes scanning the pump house. Elena stood by the window and waved her arm. "Miller, over here." The captain didn't hesitate. He grabbed Kalin by the vest and hauled him toward the building, Holloway providing a final, deafening burst of cover fire before following them. They burst into the pump house, their faces masks of sweat and dust. Miller stopped when he saw the 2 men on the floor, then his eyes found Elena, still holding the Barrett. "Vance," he gasped, his breath coming in ragged hitches. How the hell did you get out of the pit?" "I took the service shaft," Elena said, her voice sounding strange even to her. "Who are these people, Captain?" Miller knelt by the man near the door, his hand going to the man's neck. "He's cold," he said, his voice tight, "and he doesn't have any ID. No patches, no dog tags, no serial numbers on his gear." "They're ghosts," Holloway said, walking over and kicking the dead man's rifle away. "But ghosts don't use 7.62 match-grade ammo. These boys are top tier." Miller looked at Elena, his expression a mix of relief and something that looked a lot like fear. "Shepard said we had an hour," he whispered. "That was 40 minutes ago. We need to get back to the FOB." "We can't," Elena said. "Why not?" She pointed to the laptop she'd managed to save from the basement. It was sitting on a crate, the screen flickering with a new set of data. "The 3 signatures I found, they weren't the only ones." She hit a key, and a map of the entire valley appeared. It was covered in small, glowing red dots, dozens of them, forming a perfect geometric grid. "The pump station was just a test," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "They've already seeded the entire basin. It's a network, a global-scale resonance induction system." Miller looked at the map, his face turning pale. "What are they targeting?" Elena didn't answer immediately. She zoomed out, her fingers trembling as the full scale of the plan emerged. The red dots weren't just in the valley. They were following the line of the San Andreas Fault, stretching all the way from the high desert to the coast. "They're not trying to sink a valley, Captain," Elena said, her eyes locked on the screen. "They're trying to trigger the big one, and they're going to do it in the next 4 hours." The room went silent, the only sound the distant, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter. But it wasn't a U.S. helicopter. The sound was different, a low, discordant pulse that Elena had never heard before. She looked out the window. A fleet of black, unmarked gunships was cresting the horizon, their noses pointed straight at the pump station. Miller looked at Elena, then at Holloway, then back at the gunships. "Vance," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor. "What's the frequency?" Elena didn't answer. She was already at the laptop, her fingers flying across the keys. She wasn't a ghost hunter anymore. She was the one who was going to make the world stop screaming. But as the first rocket from the lead gunship streaked toward the building, she knew one thing for certain. The song was just beginning. And the end was going to be the loudest thing anyone had ever heard. The smell of scorched sagebrush and ionized air hit Staff Sergeant Elena Vance a millisecond before the first 70 Hydro rocket vaporized the rusted roof of the pump house, turning 40 years of American industrial history into a cloud of jagged iron and incandescent heat. The pressure wave slammed into her chest, a physical wall of air that emptied her lungs and tossed her across the basement floor like a discarded rag doll. For a heartbeat, the world was nothing but a silent, white void, the kind of absolute quiet that only follows a concussive blast. Then the sound rushed back in, a chaotic, screaming roar of rending metal, the rhythmic thud of rotor blades, and the high-pitched whistle of her own blood pressure hammering against her eardrums. She lay on the grit-covered concrete, her vision swimming, watching a single, glowing piece of shrapnel dance across the floor. It was beautiful in a way, the way it spun and hummed, a tiny, lethal frequency in the middle of the apocalypse. Vance, a hand grabbed her tactical vest, hauling her upward with a strength that felt like it was trying to pull her skin off. It was Miller. His face was a mask of gray dust and bright red blood, his mouth moving, but the words were lost in the roar. He shoved her toward the back of the basement, toward the service shaft she had just crawled through. She tried to plant her feet, but her equilibrium was shattered, the world tilting at a sickening 45-degree angle. She wasn't just hearing the explosion, she was feeling the resonance of the building as it began to fail. The concrete was groaning at 120 hertz, a deep structural sob that told her they had exactly 12 seconds before the upper floor collapsed into the pit. She grabbed Miller's forearm, her fingers digging into the scorched fabric of his ACU sleeve. "The drive?" she screamed, pointing back toward the crate where the laptop sat. "The map." Miller didn't hesitate. He dived back into the settling dust, a shadow moving through a landscape of fire. Elena watched him, her mind automatically calculating the structural decay of the support beams. She could see the vibration patterns in the falling soot, the way the dust particles clumped and dispersed in response to the overhead gunships. There were two of them now, circling like vultures, their 20 cannons beginning to chew the perimeter to pieces. She didn't have her sensor suite, she didn't have her headphones, but she had the bone conduction of the floor beneath her. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a third engine, not a gunship, but something ground-based. Heavy, fast, approaching from the north. Miller reappeared, the ruggedized laptop tucked under one arm like a football. He grabbed her again, and this time they didn't run, they fell. They tumbled back into the service shaft just as the main floor of the pump house gave way. The sound was a tectonic groan, 1,000,000 pounds of iron and concrete pancaking into the wet well, snuffing out the rising water with a hiss of steam and a cloud of pulverized stone. The shaft was a dark, cramped tube of safety, but only for a moment. The heat from the fire above was already radiating through the metal, the air becoming a soup of carbon monoxide and burnt rubber. They crawled. Elena led the way, her fingers raw and bleeding as she clawed through the corrugated pipe. She wasn't thinking about the fire or the rockets. She was thinking about the red dots on the map. The grid, the San Andreas. The scale of the betrayal was so vast, it felt like a physical weight on her spine. Someone had spent decades mapping the acoustic vulnerabilities of the American tectonic plates, and they had just started the countdown. She reached the end of the shaft, the grate she had kicked out earlier now a gateway back into the desert heat. She tumbled out into the sand, Miller right behind her. They were on the blind side of the pump station, shielded for the moment by the massive, scorched tanks of the secondary reservoir. "Kaylin, Halloway," Miller shouted, his voice cracking. "Over here." Halloway's voice came from behind a low concrete berm 50 yards away. He was hunched over his SAW, the barrel glowing a dull cherry red. Kaylin was beside him, frantically trying to tie a tourniquet around his own thigh. The Humvee was a smoking wreck, a testament to the accuracy of the first rocket strike. The gunships were banking for another pass, their silhouettes black against the blistering afternoon sun. They were MH-60 Stealth Hawks, unmarked, modified with noise reduction kits that made them sound like a swarm of angry bees rather than a traditional helicopter. To a normal soldier, they were ghosts. To Elena, they were a specific acoustic signature, 400 hertz on the main rotor, 1200 on the tail. She could hear the way the air moved over their composite skin. "Captain, they're using the reservoir to mask their thermals," Elena shouted, grabbing Miller's shoulder. "They think we're dead in the pump house. If we move now, we can get to the ridge. We've got no transport, Vance," Miller yelled back, gesturing to the burning Humvee. "And Kalen can't run." "He doesn't have to run," Elena said. She pointed toward the northern side of the reservoir. The third engine she had felt earlier was idling there, hidden in a dry wash. It was a Black Horizons Technical, a specialized, low-profile vehicle designed for unconventional warfare. It was what the Gray Jacket team had used to get here. It was their ticket out. "Holloway, suppress the lead bird," Miller ordered. "Vance, on me." The next 3 minutes were a blur of high-intensity violence. Holloway opened up with the SAW, the 5.56 rounds tracers arching into the sky, forcing the lead stealth hawk to break its hover. Elena and Miller stayed low, moving through the scrub brush with a frantic, desperate speed. The sand was hot enough to blister the palms of her hands, the air thick with the smell of JP-8 and death. They reached the wash just as a Gray Jacket operator was climbing out of the Technical, his rifle raised. Miller didn't even slow down. He hit the man like a linebacker, the two of them disappearing into the dust in a tangle of limbs and profanity. Elena didn't wait to see who won. She dived into the driver's seat of the Technical, her hands instantly finding the ignition. It wasn't a standard military vehicle. The dash was a clean, digital interface, the interior smelling of expensive electronics and new leather. She punched the start button, and the engine purred to life, a high-performance, turbocharged hum that felt like a thoroughbred ready to bolt. Miller climbed in a second later, dragging the Gray Jacket's rifle with him. The operator stayed in the dust, motionless. "Get the others," he barked. Elena didn't need to be told. She slammed the vehicle into gear and roared across the flat, the Technical's suspension soaking up the ruts of the desert floor with an eerie, mechanical grace. She skidded to a halt beside Holloway and Kalen, the sand spraying in a wide arc. "Get in," she screamed. Holloway grabbed Kalen, throwing him into the back of the Technical before scrambling in himself. Elena didn't wait for them to settle. She floored the accelerator, the vehicle fishtailing for a second before the traction control bit into the sand and launched them forward. Behind them, the stealth hawks realized their mistake. They banked sharply, the noses of the gunships dipping as they prepared to engage the moving target. "Vance, they are on us," Holloway yelled, struggling to mount his SAW on the Technical's rear roll bar. "I know," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She wasn't looking at the road. She was listening. She could hear the whine of the gunships targeting lasers, a high-frequency oscillation that most people couldn't perceive, but to her, it was like a physical needle pressing against her temple. "Brake left," she shouted, jerking the wheel. A second later, a stream of 20 cannon fire chewed up the sand where they had been a heartbeat before, the rounds hitting with a sound like a giant hammer hitting an anvil. "How did you know that?" Miller gasped, gripping the grab handle. "They're painting us," Elena said, her voice tight with focus. She wasn't just driving, she was navigating the invisible landscape of the electronic battlefield. She could feel the gunship's radar pulses bouncing off the Technical's skin, a rhythmic tapping in the back of her skull. She drove toward the Devil's Thumb, the massive pillar of rock rising out of the desert like a warning. It was a maze of narrow canyons and deep shadows, the kind of terrain that could mask their signature if she could just get them inside. The lead stealth hawk fired a rocket. Elena didn't see it, but she heard the sudden change in the air pressure, the sharp, whistling intake of the rocket motor. "Down!" she screamed. She swerved behind a massive boulder just as the rocket impacted the canyon wall above them. A cascade of shale and dust rained down on the Technical, the sound deafening. Elena didn't stop. She pushed the vehicle harder, the engine screaming as she navigated the narrow, twisting path. She could feel the resonance of the canyon walls, the way the sound of the gunships echoed and distorted. She used it like a sonar, finding the path with the most acoustic clutter. "They're losing us," Miller said, looking back. "They can't get a lock in here. They'll just blanket the area," Elena said. "We need to get to the repeater station. If we can't stop that grid signal, it doesn't matter if we survive this." "Where is it?" She glanced at the laptop, which Kalen was holding in his lap, his face pale from blood loss but his eyes sharp. "There's a high-gain signature 5 miles north," he said, his voice weak. "It's coming from the old Oakhaven Observatory. It's the only thing in the valley with enough power to act as a primary node." Elena nodded, her jaw set. "Then that's where we're going." The drive was a nightmare of vertical drops and narrow ledges. The technical was a beast, but the desert was trying to kill them. Elena pushed herself past the point of exhaustion, her mind a blur of frequencies and calculations. She could feel the concussion from the pump house starting to catch up with her, a dull, throbbing ache at the base of her skull that made it hard to swallow. Her ears were ringing with a steady, 8,000 hertz whine, a silver wire of sound that refused to go away. They reached the base of the observatory ridge 20 minutes later. The building was a white dome perched on the edge of a cliff, looking down over the valley like a silent, unblinking eye. It looked abandoned, but Elena knew better. She could feel the vibration of the cooling fans, a deep, industrial hum that suggested a massive amount of computing power was humming inside. Miller looked at the ridge, then at his team. "Holloway, you stay with Kalen. Keep the vehicle running. If we're not back in 15 minutes, you take the laptop and you head for the highway. Don't wait for us." Holloway nodded, his face grim. "Copy that, Captain. Good hunting." Miller looked at Elena. "You ready, Vance?" "I was ready 12 hours ago, sir," she said, her voice cold and level. They moved up the ridge on foot, staying in the shadows of the rocks. The air was thinner here, the wind whistling through the scrub brush with a lonely, mournful sound. Elena led the way, her senses tuned to the environment. She could hear the hum of the security system, a low-frequency perimeter fence that was designed to detect movement. "Stop," she whispered, holding up a hand. Miller froze. "What is it?" "Pressure sensors," she said, pointing to a faint line in the dust, "and an acoustic tripwire. If we step on that, the whole ridge is going to know we're here." She knelt by the wire, her fingers hovering an inch above the sand. It wasn't a physical wire. It was a localized field of ultrasonic sound. If something broke the field, the change in frequency would trigger the alarm. She reached into her kit and pulled out a small, handheld signal generator she'd salvaged from the pump house. She began to dial in the frequency, her eyes closed, her mind visualizing the waves. She found the match, a perfect 40 kilohertz sine wave, and projected it into the field. "Now," she whispered. They stepped through the gap, the alarm silent. Miller looked at her, a flicker of awe in his eyes. "You're wasted in the signal core, Vance." "I'm exactly where I need to be, sir," she replied. They reached the observatory's main entrance, a heavy, reinforced steel door that looked like it belonged on a vault. There were no guards, no cameras, no signs of life. Just the steady, relentless hum of the cooling fans. Miller tried the handle. It didn't move. He looked at the electronic keypad, his brow furrowed. "Can you bypass it?" "I don't need to," Elena said. She put her ear to the door, listening to the internal mechanism. She could hear the tumblers, the way the magnetic lock was cycling. It was a high-end system, but it had a flaw. All mechanical systems had a resonance frequency. She took the Grey Jacket's rifle from Miller and pressed the barrel against the door's locking mechanism. She didn't fire. She waited, listening to the hum of the cooling fans inside. She waited for the moment when the frequency of the fans matched the natural resonance of the door frame. "Now," she said, and hit the door with the butt of the rifle. The magnetic lock shuddered, the frequency of the impact disrupting the field just long enough for the latch to click. The door swung open with a hiss of pressurized air. Inside, the observatory was a cathedral of technology. Racks of servers lined the walls, their blue LEDs flickering in the dark like the eyes of some digital beast. In the center of the room, beneath the telescope's massive mounting, sat a console that looked like it belonged in a NASA control room. And standing at the console was the man from the pit. He didn't look surprised to see them. He didn't even look concerned. He was typing away at the keyboard, his movements calm and methodical. The silver device, the tuning fork, was sitting on the desk beside him, glowing with a soft, internal light. "Step away from the console," Miller ordered, his rifle leveled at the man's chest. The man didn't look up. "You're late, Captain Miller," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, the accent a perfect mid-Atlantic neutral. "I expected you 5 minutes ago. Your Sergeant Vance is quite resourceful, but even she can't stop the physics of what's already in motion." Elena stepped forward, her eyes locked on the console. The screen was showing the same map she'd seen at the pump station, but the red dots were no longer stationary. They were pulsing in a rhythmic, synchronized pattern. A countdown was running in the corner of the screen. 00, 14, 22. 14 minutes, she whispered. 14 minutes until the primary harmonic is reached, the man said, finally looking up. He wasn't old, perhaps in his late 30s, with a face that was handsome in a cold, sterile way. He looked like a man who spent his life thinking in equations. This isn't a war, Sergeant, it's an adjustment. The West Coast has been overdue for a century. We're just providing the catalyst. Who are you? Miller demanded. Who are you working for? The man smiled, a thin, humorless thing. It doesn't matter. By tomorrow, the map of the United States will be rewritten. The economic and political center of gravity will shift. It's a necessary correction. Elena didn't listen to the words. She listened to the room. She could hear the server racks, the cooling fans, the steady, rhythmic pulse of the signal being transmitted from the dome above. It was a beautiful signal, complex, layered, a masterpiece of acoustic engineering. It was the sound of a world breaking. And it was being fed by the silver device on the desk. Miller, he's the transmitter, Elena said, her voice trembling with a sudden, sharp realization. The servers are just the data. The tuning fork, it's the master oscillator. It's what's syncing the entire grid. Miller didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The round hit the man in the center of his chest, the impact throwing him back against the console. He slumped to the floor, his eyes wide and vacant, the smile still frozen on his face. But the signal didn't stop. The silver device continued to glow, its pulse becoming faster, more intense. The countdown on the screen didn't flicker. 00, 1305. I killed him, why didn't it stop? Miller shouted, moving toward the console. It's a closed-loop system, Elena said, her fingers flying across the keys. He's already uploaded the sequence. The device is slaved to the tectonic feedback. It doesn't need him anymore. She tried to access the override, but the screen was locked behind a level of encryption that would take a supercomputer weeks to break. She tried to physically disconnect the device, but as her hand got close, a sharp, electric shock threw her back. It's protected by an induction field, she gasped, her arm going numb. We can't touch it. Miller looked at the countdown. 12 minutes. Vance, tell me you have a plan B. Elena looked around the room, her mind racing. She could feel the vibration in the floor. The primary wave was already starting to build deep in the earth. The observatory was situated directly over a secondary fault line, a branch of the San Andreas. It was the perfect place for a repeater. She looked up at the telescope. It wasn't an optical telescope. It was a radio dish, a massive 30-meter ear pointed at the sky. The dish, she said. If we can reverse the polarity of the feed, we can use the dish as a giant acoustic dampener. We can broadcast a counterfrequency into the ground. Can you do that? Miller asked. I can try, Elena said, but I need to get to the primary feed horn. It's at the top of the dome. I'll cover the door, Miller said, checking his magazine. The gray jackets won't be far behind. Elena didn't wait for him to finish. She scrambled up the ladder that led to the telescope's mounting, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air was colder here, the wind whistling through the dome's aperture. She reached the feed horn, a massive, complex assembly of copper and glass that sat at the focal point of the dish. She opened the access panel, her hands shaking. The wires were a nightmare of proprietary tech and military-grade shielding. She didn't have her tools. She didn't have her sensors. All she had was her ears. She put her head against the horn, listening to the signal. It was a roar now, a deafening, metallic shriek that felt like it was trying to peel the skin off her skull. She could feel her own resonance, the way her bones were beginning to vibrate in sympathy with the signal. She needed to find the carrier wave. The one frequency that held the whole thing together. She found it. 22.4 hertz. A deep, subsonic thrum that was below the range of human hearing, but she could feel it in her gut. A sickening, rhythmic pulse. She grabbed a pair of pliers from her belt and began to strip the wires, her fingers bleeding as the sharp copper bit into her skin. She wasn't thinking about the pain. She was thinking about the millions of people in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in Oak Haven, who had no idea that the ground beneath their feet was about to become their grave. She cross-connected the leads, her mind calculating the phase shift. She needed exactly 180 degrees of separation. If she was off by even a fraction of a percent, she wouldn't dampen the signal, she would amplify it. She would become part of the disaster. She finished the connection and looked down at the console. The countdown was at 00:08:42. "Miller," she shouted. Hit the transmit button. The door to the observatory burst open. A team of gray jackets flooded into the room, their suppressed rifles spitting fire. Miller returned fire, the sound of the M4 deafening in the enclosed space. He was pinned behind the console, the rounds chewing into the electronics. "I can't get to it," he yelled, his voice strained. Elena looked down from the feed horn. She saw the gray jackets moving in a tactical sweep, their movements cold and professional. They didn't care about the countdown. They didn't care about the world. They only cared about the mission. She looked at the dish. She was 30 feet in the air, perched on a narrow, vibrating ledge. There was no way down that didn't involve a bullet. She looked at the feed horn. The signal was already beginning to phase shift, the copper glowing with a dull, blue light. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She just acted. She jumped. She hit the floor of the observatory with a bone-jarring impact, the breath knocked out of her. She rolled, the bullets whistling over her head, and dived behind a server rack. She wasn't looking for cover. She was looking for the power coupling. She found it, a thick black cable that ran from the racks to the console. She grabbed it with both hands and pulled, the cable sparking as it tore free from the wall. The lights in the room flickered and died. The server racks went dark. The only thing still glowing was the silver device and the countdown on the screen, 00:05:12. The gray jackets paused, their night vision goggles humming as they adjusted to the sudden dark. Elena used the silence. She moved through the room like a ghost, her senses guiding her. She could hear the breathing of the men, the rustle of their gear, the steady, rhythmic beat of their hearts. She wasn't a soldier. She was an acoustic predator. She came up behind the lead operator and drove her knife into the gap between his helmet and his vest. He went down without a sound. She took his rifle and fired a burst into the darkness, the muzzle flash illuminating the room for a split second. 2 more gray jackets went down. "Miller," Elena screamed. "Now." Miller dived for the console, his hand slamming into the transmit button. The observatory shuddered. A deep, powerful hum erupted from the telescope dish, a sound so loud it was beyond hearing. It was a physical force, a wall of vibration that hit the ground and kept going. The floor of the observatory buckled, the windows shattering into a million pieces. The gray jackets were thrown to their knees, their hands over their ears, their faces contorted in agony. Miller and Elena were pinned to the floor, the pressure so intense they couldn't even breathe. Elena looked at the countdown, 00:02:01. The red dots on the screen began to flicker. The pulse was slowing. The counter frequency was working. The resonance was being broken. But the silver device wasn't giving up. It began to glow with a blinding, white light, the frequency shifting higher and higher, a desperate attempt to find a new harmonic. The sound was a scream now, a high-pitched, metallic wail that felt like it was tearing Elena's brain apart. She could feel the blood beginning to leak from her ears. The world was a blur of white light and agonizing sound. She looked at Miller, his face a mask of pain, his eyes locked on hers. They weren't going to make it. The device was going to overload, and when it did, it would take the entire ridge with it. Elena looked at the device. It was sitting on the console, just 5 feet away. The induction field was still active, a shimmering wall of energy that would kill anyone who touched it. But the field was a frequency, and every frequency had a dead spot. She closed her eyes. She tuned out the pain, the noise, the fear. She focused on the shimmer. She could hear the way the air was vibrating around the device. 400 hertz, 402, 405. She found the rhythm, the heartbeat of the field. She reached out, her hand moving in perfect synchronization with the vibration. Her fingers passed through the field, the air feeling cold and thick, but the shock didn't come. She grabbed the silver device. The world exploded in a blinding flash of white. Elena felt herself being lifted, thrown, shattered. She was a wave, a frequency, a single, lonely note in a symphony of destruction. She could feel the earth beneath her, the massive, tectonic plates groaning and shifting, and then, Silence, the absolute, perfect silence of the desert night. Elena opened her eyes. She was lying on the floor of the observatory, the stars visible through the shattered dome. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and dust. The countdown on the screen was gone. The red dots were gone. The silver device lay in her hand, cold and dead. She tried to move, but her body felt like it was made of lead. She looked around the room. The gray jackets were gone. Whether they had fled or been destroyed in the blast, she couldn't tell. Miller was sitting against the console, his head in his hands. He looked up, his face pale and haggard, his eyes bloodshot. "Vance," he croaked. "I'm here, sir," she said, her voice a whisper. He looked at the device in her hand, then at the shattered dome. "Is it over?" Elena listened. She didn't hear the roar of the gunships. She didn't hear the hum of the servers. She didn't hear the scream of the earth. She only heard the wind whistling through the ruins. "Yes, sir," she said. "It's over." They sat there for a long time, two broken people in a broken world. The sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and fire. It was beautiful in a way that only a world that had been saved could be. But the silence didn't last. The sound of helicopters returned, real helicopters this time. UH-60 Black Hawks, their rotors a familiar, comforting thud. They were coming from the north, from FOB Ironside. Miller stood up, his movements slow and painful. He offered a hand to Elena, and she took it, her fingers gripping his with a strength she didn't know she still had. They walked out of the observatory, out into the light of the new day. The Black Hawks were landing on the ridge, the soldiers spilling out with their rifles at the ready. In the lead was Colonel Shepard. She looked at the ruined observatory, at the bodies of the gray jackets, and finally at Miller and Vance. "Captain," she said, her voice neutral. "Sergeant, you've had a busy night." Miller offered a sharp, albeit shaky, salute. "Mission accomplished, Colonel. The grid is down." Shepard looked at Elena. She looked at the blood on her face, the silver device in her hand, and the cold, flat look in her eyes. "Major Higgins is already preparing the court-martial papers," she said, "for insubordination, theft of military property, and engaging in unauthorized combat operations." Miller's jaw tightened. "Colonel, with all due respect," Shepard held up a hand. "But the Pentagon is also asking who the hell saved the West Coast from an 8.5 magnitude earthquake." She looked at Elena for a long time, her eyes narrowing. "Sergeant Vance, you're a problem. You don't follow orders. You don't trust the chain of command. And you're the most dangerous person I've ever had under my command." Elena didn't blink. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, the weight of the device in her hand a reminder of the cost of being right. "I'm taking you back to Ironside," Shepard said. "There's going to be an inquiry, a long one, and you're not going to like what they find." She turned and walked back toward her helicopter, the wind from the rotors whipping her hair across her face. Miller looked at Elena. "I'll fight for you, Vance. You know that." "I know, sir," Elena said. She looked at the silver device one last time before dropping it into the sand. She didn't need it. She didn't need the validation. She didn't need the medals. She had saved the world, and she had done it her way. As she climbed into the Black Hawk, she felt the vibration of the engine, a steady 400 hertz thrum. It was a good sound, a human sound. She closed her eyes and let the silence take her. She was still a ghost hunter, but for the first time in her life, the ghosts were quiet. The transport flight back to FOB Ironside was a study in sensory deprivation. The cabin of the Black Hawk was a vibrating metal box, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the rotors, a dull, repetitive pulse that Elena felt in the marrow of her bones. She sat on the canvas bench, her head back against the fuselage, watching the dust motes dance in the streaks of sunlight. Across from her, Miller was talking to a medic, his words lost in the acoustic wash. He looked 10 years older than he had when they left the dam. His uniform was shredded, his face a map of exhaustion and relief, but there was a new hardness in his eyes. He had seen the truth, and it had changed him. Elena looked down at her hands. They were stained with grease, blood, and the fine, white dust of the observatory. Her fingernails were broken, her knuckles raw. She felt hollow, a vessel that had been emptied of everything but the lingering resonance of the night. Her ears were still ringing, but it was a different frequency now, a low, mournful hum that felt like the earth itself was exhaling. She thought about the man in the observatory. His face, his calm, his absolute certainty. He hadn't been an enemy in the traditional sense. He hadn't hated her. He had simply been an engineer of a different kind of world. To him, the destruction of the West Coast was a variable in an equation, a necessary adjustment for a future she couldn't see. He was the product of a system that valued efficiency over life, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. The Black Hawk flared for landing, the downdraft kicking up a storm of sand as they touched down on the tarmac of the airport turn base. The doors slid open, and the heat of the Mojave hit Elena like a physical blow. It was only 0900, but the sun was already a white, punishing weight in the sky. A line of MPs was waiting for them. They didn't have their weapons drawn, but their stance was unmistakable, a cordon of institutional authority. Behind them stood Major Higgins, his uniform pristine, his face a mask of bureaucratic fury. "Staff Sergeant Vance, step out of the aircraft," one of the MPs ordered, his voice amplified by a megaphone. Elena stood up. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, but she didn't stumble. She walked out of the helicopter, her head held high, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere on the horizon. Miller tried to step forward, but Shepard caught his arm, shaking her head. "Not now, Captain," she said, her voice quiet. "Let the process work." Elena was led away from the flight line toward the reinforced concrete bunker that served as the base's detention facility. She didn't look back. She didn't look at the soldiers who were staring at her, the men of Alpha Company who had heard the rumors of what happened at the pump station. She could feel their eyes on her, a mixture of awe and suspicion. To them, she was a hero who had gone rogue. To the institution, she was a liability that needed to be contained. The cell was a 6x8 concrete box with a single, high window that let in a sliver of blue sky. It was cool inside, the air smelling of antiseptic and stale sweat. They took her gear, her vest, her boots, and her pride, leaving her in a thin, olive-drab jumpsuit that felt like a second skin. She sat on the edge of the cot and waited. She didn't know how long she was there. Time had lost its meaning, measured only by the changing angle of the sun on the floor. She listened to the sounds of the base, the roar of the jets, the rhythmic clatter of the trucks, the distant, muffled shouting of the drills. She mapped the acoustics of the bunker, the way the sound reflected off the walls, the hidden frequencies of the air conditioning. She was still a ghost hunter, even in a cage. The door opened late in the afternoon. It wasn't Higgins, it wasn't Miller, it was Colonel Shepard. She was alone. She didn't have her clipboard, she didn't have her staff. She just had a folder and a look of grim determination. She sat on the small, bolted-down stool across from Elena. For a long time, she didn't say anything. She just looked at Elena, her eyes searching for something, a crack, a sign of regret, a flicker of fear. She didn't find it. "You saved a lot of lives, Sergeant," Shepard said finally, her voice low. "The official report is going to say that a seismic anomaly was averted by a combined tactical response from Alpha Company and the specialized signal units. Your name won't be in it." "I didn't do it for the name, Colonel," Elena said, her voice sounding strange and small in the quiet cell. "I know you didn't," Shepard replied, "which is why you're such a problem." She opened the folder and took out a sheet of paper. "This is a non-disclosure agreement. You sign this, you agree never to speak of the observatory, the gray jackets, or the resonance grid. In exchange, the court-martial charges are dropped. You'll be honorably discharged for medical reasons, combat-related hearing loss. You get your pension, you get your VA benefits, and you disappear. And if I don't sign?" Shepard looked at the window. "Then you spend the next 20 years in Leavenworth for treason. The ghosts you fought, they have very long reaches, Sergeant. They're already rewriting the history of last night. They can't afford for you to be a hero. They need you to be a ghost." Elena looked at the paper. It was a contract of silence, a way for the system to swallow the truth and pretend it never happened. It was a betrayal of everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed. But she also knew that she couldn't win this battle. The institution was too large, the conspiracy too deep. If she went to prison, the truth died with her. If she signed, she stayed free. She stayed alive. She looked at Shepard. "Why are you doing this, Colonel? Why give me the choice?" Shepard stood up. She looked at the door, then back at Elena. "Because I was at the dam, Sergeant. I saw the mountain fall, and I saw you stand in the middle of it." She walked to the door and paused, her hand on the handle. There are people in this world who build things, and there are people who break them. And then there's you. You're the one who hears the world when it's about to break. We need people like you, Elena, even if we can't admit it." She left the folder on the cot and walked out. Elena sat in the silence of the cell, the paper mocking her. She could feel the vibration of the world outside, the steady, rhythmic pulse of a civilization that had no idea how close it had come to the end. She thought about the map, the grid, the red dots. They were still there, hidden in the earth, waiting for the next catalyst. The war wasn't over. It had just gone underground. She picked up the pen. Her hand was steady. Her mind was clear. She signed her name. The reckoning was over. The silence had begun, but as she looked out at the sliver of blue sky, Elena Vance knew one thing for certain. She wasn't finished. She still heard the song. And as long as she could hear it, she would be ready. Because the earth never truly stops screaming. It just waits for someone who knows how to listen. The sun set over the Mojave, the shadows stretching long and thin across the sand. In the distance, the first stars began to appear, silent and cold. Elena Vance stood in her cell, her eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the door to open. She was a ghost now, a secret, a whisper in the dark, and she had never felt more alive. The white-tiled hallways of the infirmary at FOB Ironside smelled of industrial bleach and the metallic tang of dried blood, a sterile contrast to the scorched earth scent of the Mojave that still clung to Staff Sergeant Elena Vance's skin. Every footstep of the two military policemen flanking her echoed with a sharp, percussive crack that made the base of her skull throb in time with her pulse. She didn't look at them. She didn't look at the soldiers in the hallway who stopped and pressed themselves against the walls to let the small, grim procession pass. She kept her gaze fixed on the back of the MP's neck ahead of her, counting the individual hairs that had escaped his high-end tight haircut. It was a rhythmic exercise, a way to anchor herself in a world that felt increasingly like it was vibrating at a frequency her body could no longer sustain. They led her into a small, windowless examination room. A captain from the medical corps was waiting, his sleeves rolled up and a pair of latex gloves snapping into place over his hands. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask her how she felt. He simply pointed to the examination table covered in crinkled white paper. Elena sat. The paper crunched under her weight, a sound that felt like a tectonic shift in the small room. The MPs took up positions on either side of the door, their arms crossed over their vests, their faces impassive behind mirrored Oakley sunglasses. They weren't there to protect her. They were there to ensure the asset remained contained until the institution decided what to do with the mess she had left behind at the Oak Haven Observatory. The doctor moved with the practiced, detached efficiency of a man who had seen too many ruined bodies to be moved by another one. He checked her pupils, the light from his pen torch a blinding, white needle that seemed to pierce straight through to her cerebellum. He felt the swelling at the base of her neck, his fingers cold and clinical. Then, he picked up an otoscope. Elena felt a sudden, sharp spike of anxiety, not because of the pain, but because of what he might find. Her ears were still ringing, a steady 8,000 hertz whine that felt like a silver wire stretched tight inside her head. But beneath that, there was a new silence. A dead zone in her left ear where the world used to live. The doctor peered into her ear canal, his brow furrowing. He adjusted the light and leaned in closer. He spent a long time looking at the left side, then switched to the right. When he finally pulled back, he stripped off his gloves and tossed them into the biohazard bin with a wet slap. He walked over to a metal cabinet and pulled out a small, handheld device with a pair of headphones attached. Elena knew what it was. An audiometry test. "Put these on, Sergeant," he said. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice was flat, a Midwestern drawl that felt heavy and tired. Elena took the headphones. They were heavy, the padding cracked and smelling of the dozens of soldiers who had worn them before her. She slid them over her ears, and the world disappeared. The hum of the air conditioner, the rhythmic tapping of the MP's boot, the distant roar of a C-130 taking off, all of it was gone, replaced by a vacuum of artificial silence. She held the small plastic button in her right hand, her thumb hovering over the trigger. The test began. A series of tones, ranging from the deep, belly-rumbling lows to the crystalline highs. On the right side, she heard them all. Her thumb clicked the button with mechanical precision, a reflex born of years of signal training. But then the tones shifted to the left. Silence. She waited. She knew there should be a sound. She could see the doctor's hand moving on the dial, adjusting the decibel levels, pushing the frequency higher. She could feel the vibration of the headphones against her jawbone, a phantom sensation of sound that never reached her brain. She stared at the wall, at a small, coffee-colored stain on the plaster, and waited for the ping. It never came. The doctor stopped. He didn't look at her as he scribbled notes onto a clipboard. He didn't need to. They both knew what the test had revealed. The acoustic blast at the observatory, the resonance of the induction field, it had cost her. The ghost hunter had lost the very thing that made her extraordinary. The left side of her world was now a shadow, a muffled, gray landscape where the subtle frequencies of the earth would no longer register. "You've got significant sensorineural hearing loss in the left ear," Sergeant, the doctor said, finally looking up. "Total loss at the higher frequencies. Permanent. The right side is damaged, but it might recover some function over the next few weeks. For now, you're looking at a profile. No combat duty. No flight lines." Elena didn't blink. She didn't let her hands shake. She just nodded, a single, sharp movement of her chin. "Thank you, sir." The doctor looked at her for a second longer, a flicker of something that might have been pity in his eyes. But he was a military doctor, and pity was an unauthorized emotion in a war zone. He turned back to his notes. The MPs stepped forward, the silent signal that the medical evaluation was over. They led her out of the room and back into the hallway, toward the administrative heart of the base. As they walked, Elena felt the weight of the silence in her left ear. It was a physical presence, a hole in the world that she would have to learn to navigate. She thought about the observatory, about the way the silver device had felt in her hand, vibrant, terrifying, a piece of the world's hidden architecture. She had broken the resonance. She had saved the coast. And in return, the world had taken a piece of her. It felt like a fair trade in the cold mathematics of the desert. They reached the legal wing, a series of prefabricated buildings that looked like shipping containers joined together. This was the territory of the JAG officers and the investigators, the place where truth was negotiated and filtered through the lens of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The MPs led her into a small, windowless waiting room and left her there, one of them standing guard at the door. Elena sat on a hard plastic chair, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She waited. The clock on the wall was a cheap, battery-operated thing, its second hand ticking with a rhythmic, mechanical click that felt like a hammer hitting an anvil in her right ear. 10 minutes. 20. 45. The door to the inner office opened, and a man walked out. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked too expensive for the Mojave, his face a mask of smooth, Ivy League confidence. He didn't look like a soldier, but he moved with a quiet, lethal grace that Elena recognized. He was one of the men in suits Shepard had mentioned. A ghost from the higher reaches of the intelligence community. He didn't look at Elena. He spoke to the MP at the door in a low, modulated voice and then walked out of the building without a backward glance. "Staff Sergeant Vance," a voice called from the office. Elena stood up and walked into the room. It was larger than she expected, dominated by a heavy wooden desk and a wall of filing cabinets. Major Higgins was sitting behind the desk, his face a shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure was nearing critical levels. Beside him sat Colonel Shepard, her expression unreadable, her hands steepled in front of her. In the corner, a young first lieutenant from the JAG Corps sat with a laptop, his fingers poised over the keys. "Sit down, Sergeant," Higgins barked. Elena sat. She didn't look at Higgins. She looked at Shepard. The colonel's eyes were tired, the skin around them translucent and gray. She looked like a woman who had spent the last 12 hours fighting a war that didn't involve bullets or rockets. "Sergeant Vance, do you understand the severity of the charges being leveled against you?" Higgins asked, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. He didn't wait for her to answer. Insubordination, theft of government property, unauthorized use of a military vehicle, engagement with unknown hostiles without a direct order. You bypassed the chain of command, you ignored a direct reassignment, and you put a highly sensitive intelligence asset at risk. Elena remained silent. She knew that any defense she offered would be used as a weapon against her. She was a signal sergeant. She knew how to protect the frequency. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Higgins leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. He wanted her to beg. He wanted her to offer an excuse, a justification, something he could tear apart. I followed the signal, sir, Elena said, her voice level and cold. Higgins slammed his hand onto the desk, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. The signal? There was no signal. The reports from the NGA, from the USCs, from every sensor suite we have in this theater say there was nothing but a minor seismic tremor. You chased a ghost into the desert and burned down a multi-million-dollar facility in the process. Elena looked at the laptop on the JAG officer's desk. She thought about the map, the red dots, the countdown. She thought about the man in the observatory and the way the Earth had groaned under his touch. The reports are wrong, sir, she said quietly. Major Higgins laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. The reports are wrong. Every intelligence agency in the United States government is wrong, and you, a disgraced signal sergeant with a history of auditory hallucinations, are right. Is that your defense? It's not a defense, sir. It's a fact. Higgins turned to Shepard. Colonel, I want her stripped of her rank. I want her in a cell at Leavenworth before the sun goes down. She's a liability. She's dangerous. Shepard didn't look at him. She was looking at a file on the desk, her fingers tracing the edge of a photograph. It was a satellite image of the observatory ridge, the white dome shattered, the ground around it scorched. The men in suits just left, Major, Shepard said, her voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced Higgins immediately. They've classified the entire incident. Level 5. Need to know only. The observatory doesn't exist. The gray jackets don't exist. And the seismic tremor was an atmospheric anomaly caused by a malfunctioning weather satellite. Higgins blinked, his mouth hanging open for a second. But the bodies, the tech, we have the technical in the hangar. No, we don't, Shepard said, finally looking up. The technical was picked up an hour ago by a private contractor. The bodies were removed by the medical team that arrived with the men in suits. As far as the official record is concerned, Sergeant Vance and Captain Miller went on a long-range reconnaissance patrol that resulted in a vehicular accident and a fire at an abandoned industrial site. Higgins slumped back in his chair, the purple fading from his face, replaced by a dull, sickly yellow. They're burying it, he whispered. They're containing it, Shepard corrected. There's a difference. She turned her gaze to Elena. The look in her eyes wasn't anger, it was something else. A weary, professional respect that felt like a heavy cloak. Sergeant Vance, you're being placed on administrative leave effective immediately, Shepard said. You'll be restricted to the base. No communication with the outside world. No contact with your team. You'll report to the base psychiatrist every morning at 0800. If you follow these orders to the letter, the court-martial charges will be held in abeyance. If you breathe a word of what you saw at that observatory to anyone, and I mean anyone, you will disappear into a federal prison and the key will be melted down. Do you understand? Elena felt the weight of the silence in her left ear. It was the price of the truth. I understand, Colonel. Dismissed, Shepard said. Elena stood up, offered a sharp, perfect salute, and walked out of the room. She didn't look at Higgins. She didn't need to see the reckoning in his eyes. He was a man who had built his career on the foundation of the institution, and that foundation had just shifted beneath his feet. He had been proven wrong by a sergeant he had dismissed as broken, and then he had been told by his superiors that his reality was a lie. It was a quiet, bureaucratic kind of death, and it was exactly what he deserved. She walked back out into the heat of the afternoon. The MP was still there, but he didn't grab her arm this time. He just followed her at a respectful distance as she walked toward the barracks. The base was humming with its usual energy, but to Elena, it felt like a ghost town. She saw the soldiers of Alpha Company sitting outside their tents, cleaning their rifles, smoking, laughing. They looked the same, but the world they lived in was a different one than the one she had just returned from. They believed in the reports. They believed in the chain of command. They believed that the ground beneath their feet was solid. She reached the barracks, a long, low building that smelled of floor wax and stale air. Her bunk was at the end of the row, her locker still standing open from when she had left. Someone had gone through her things, the institution's way of ensuring she hadn't kept any trophies. Her sensor suite was gone, her headphones were gone, even her personal notebook had been taken. She sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the empty locker. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. It wasn't the loneliness of a person who is alone, it was the loneliness of a person who knows a truth that no one else can hear. Vance. She turned her head. Miller was standing in the doorway. He looked like he had been through a shredder. His arm was in a sling, his face covered in butterfly bandages, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He was leaning against the doorframe, his weight on his good leg. "Captain," Elena said, standing up. "Sit down, Sergeant," Miller said, his voice a raspy whisper. He walked over and sat on the bunk opposite hers. The MP stayed at the door, watching them with a bored expression. "I heard what happened in the office," Miller said. "Shepard told me. She told you about the NDA?" Miller nodded. "They gave me the same choice. Sign the paper and walk away with a silver star for valor in a reconnaissance mission, or fight it and lose everything. What are you going to do, sir?" Miller looked at his hands, his fingers twitching. "I already signed it, Vance. For the men, if I fight it, Holloway and Kalin lose their benefits. Kalin's going to need a lot of physical therapy. Holloway has a kid on the way. I couldn't let them pay for my pride." Elena felt a surge of respect for him. He was a good officer. He understood that loyalty to the mission sometimes meant sacrificing the truth. "How's Kalin?" she asked. "He's stable. They're flying him out to Landstuhl tonight. He's going to lose the leg, Vance. But he's alive. Because of you." Elena looked at the floor. "I just followed the signal, sir." "No," Miller said, leaning forward, his voice intense. "You didn't just follow it. You heard it when no one else would. You stood your ground when the whole world was telling you that you were crazy. I've been in the Army for 15 years, Sergeant. I've seen a lot of things, but I've never seen anyone do what you did." He reached out and put his hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and warm. "You're the best soldier I've ever served with, Elena, and I'm sorry." "For what, sir?" "For the fact that you're going to have to carry this by yourself. For the fact that the world is never going to know your name." Elena looked into his eyes and saw the truth there. He was a man who had seen the world break, and he was still not over it. He was a partner, a witness, the one person who saw her clearly when everyone else was blind. "It's okay, sir," she said, her voice soft. "I know what I know." Miller nodded, a slow, heavy movement. He stood up, his face tight with pain. "I'm being reassigned to Fort Bragg. I leave at 0600. I don't think we'll see each other again, Sergeant." "Probably not, sir." Miller offered his hand and Elena took it. It wasn't a military handshake. It was a silent agreement between two people who had stood on the edge of the apocalypse and survived. "Good luck, Vance." "You too, Captain." He walked out of the barracks, his silhouette disappearing into the bright light of the desert. Elena sat back down on the bunk and listened to the silence. The next few days were a blur of administrative purgatory. She reported to the psychiatrist every morning, a soft-spoken woman who tried to get her to talk about trauma and auditory processing disorders. Elena gave her nothing. She sat in the chair and stared at a point on the wall, her answers short, professional, and entirely uninformative. She was controlled. She was disciplined. She was the perfect soldier, and the psychiatrist hated it. She spent the rest of her time in the library or the gym, avoiding the other soldiers. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life. She could see the world moving around her, the familiar rhythms of the base continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The colors seemed duller, the sounds muffled. The silence in her left ear was a constant reminder of what she had lost. On the fourth day, she was summoned to the motor pool. Holloway was there, leaning against a Humvee, a wrench in his hand. He looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a wide, gap-toothed grin. "Vance," he shouted, wiping his hands on a greasy rag, "I heard you were in the brig." "Not quite, Holloway," Elena said, a small smile touching her lips. "Just administrative leave." He walked over and clapped her on the shoulder, his touch heavy and honest. "Man, that was some night, wasn't it? I still don't know what the hell happened at that observatory, but I'm glad you were there." "How's the truck?" Elena asked, gesturing to the Humvee. "She's a piece of junk," Holloway said, laughing, "but she's my piece of junk." "Listen, Vance, I wanted to tell you. I know things are weird right now. I know the brass is being cagey. But the guys, We know you saved us at the pump house. We know you're the reason we're all still breathing." Elena felt a lump in her throat that she couldn't swallow. "Thank you, Holloway." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of metal. It was a fragment of a 70 rocket, the edges scorched and twisted. "I found this in the wreckage of the Technical before the spooks took it away. I thought you might want it." Elena took the metal, its surface rough and cold against her palm. It was a piece of the apocalypse, a physical memory of the moment the world had almost ended. "Thanks," she whispered. Holloway nodded, his expression turning serious. "Take care of yourself, Vance. Don't let them grind you down." "I won't." She walked away from the motor pool, the piece of shrapnel tucked into her pocket. It was the only thing she had left of that night. No medals, no commendations, no official record. Just a piece of twisted steel and a hole in her hearing. As she walked back toward the barracks, she saw Major Higgins standing outside the headquarters building. He was talking to a group of junior officers, his voice loud and blustering, his chest puffed out. He looked like a man who was back in control, a man who had successfully navigated a crisis and come out on top. But as Elena passed him, he stopped mid-sentence. His eyes met hers, and for a split second the mask slipped. She saw the fear there, the uncertainty, the knowledge that he was a small man in a very large and dangerous world. Elena didn't say a word. She didn't salute. She just kept walking, her head held high, the rhythm of her footsteps the only sound in the world. That night, she couldn't sleep. The silence in her left ear felt heavy, a physical weight that pressed against her brain. She got up and walked out of the barracks, out into the cool air of the desert night. The base was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the generators and the soft rustle of the wind through the sagebrush. Elena walked toward the perimeter fence, toward the place where the desert met the sky. She stood there for a long time, looking out at the darkness. She thought about the map, the red dots, the countdown. She thought about the man in the observatory and the way he had smiled as the world began to break. She realized then that the war wasn't over. It had just changed shape. The people who had built the resonance grid were still out there. The ghosts were still moving in the shadows, mapping the vulnerabilities of the Earth, preparing for the next adjustment. The institution had buried the truth to protect itself, but the truth didn't stay buried. It was like a frequency. It always found a way to reach the surface. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the piece of shrapnel. She held it up to the starlight, watching the way the jagged edges caught the light. She wasn't a soldier anymore. Not really. She was a witness. A ghost hunter who had lost her hearing but found her purpose. She thought about the silence in her left ear. It wasn't a void. It was a space. A space where the truth could live, protected from the noise and the lies of the world. She closed her eyes and listened. She didn't hear the hum of the generators. She didn't hear the rustle of the wind. She didn't hear the mechanical click of the clock. She heard the earth. It was a deep, subsonic thrum, a vibration that came from miles below the surface. It was the sound of the plates shifting, of the magma moving, of the planet breathing. It was a beautiful, terrifying symphony of power and pressure. And for the first time since the observatory, Elena Vance felt at peace. She knew what she had to do. She knew that her time at FOB Ironside was coming to an end. She knew that the institution would try to disappear her, to turn her into a footnote in a classified report. But she also knew that they couldn't stop her. She was Staff Sergeant Elena Vance, and she heard the world when it was about to break. And as long as she could feel the vibration, she would be ready. She turned and walked back toward the barracks, her footsteps light and purposeful. She didn't need a sensor suite. She didn't need a headset. She didn't need the validation of the brass. She had the signal, and that was enough. The next morning, the door to her barracks opened at 0500. It wasn't an MP. It was Colonel Shepard. She was wearing her flight suit, her helmet tucked under her arm. She looked at Elena, her expression grim but not unkind. "Get your things, Sergeant," she said. "You're being moved." "Where to, Colonel?" "A secure facility in Virginia," Shepard said, "for extended medical evaluation." Elena knew what that meant. It was the final step of the containment. A place where she could be watched, studied, and eventually forgotten. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply nodded and began to pack her small bag. She put the piece of shrapnel at the very bottom, beneath her extra socks. She put her signed NDA on top of it. She walked out of the barracks and into the cold light of the morning. A blacked-out SUV was waiting for her, its engine idling with a low, rhythmic hum. Shepard stood by the door, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I did what I could, Elena," she said, her voice a whisper. "I know, Colonel," Elena replied. She climbed into the back of the SUV, the tinted glass swallowing the world outside. The door closed with a soft, heavy thud. As the vehicle began to move, Elena leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. She felt the vibration of the engine. She felt the resonance of the road. She felt the deep, steady pulse of the earth beneath the tires. The reckoning was over. The silence had begun. But in the darkness of the SUV, Elena Vance was smiling, because she could still hear the song, and the song was just beginning. The SUV wound its way through the labyrinthine checkpoints of FOB Ironside, the tires crunching on the gravel with a rhythm that Elena tracked instinctively. She sat in the back, her hands flat on her knees, feeling the subtle shifts in torque and momentum. To anyone else, it was a simple ride to a transport plane. To her, it was a sequence of frequencies. The 120 Hz vibration of the engine, the high-pitched whine of the turbocharger, the rhythmic thud of the tires over the expansion joints in the tarmac. The silence in her left ear was no longer a void. It was a canvas. She found herself focusing on the sounds that did reach her, the details more vivid now that the acoustic landscape had been halved. She could hear the driver's breathing, a steady, shallow pattern that suggested he was nervous. She could hear the rustle of Colonel Shepard's flight suit in the front seat, the metallic clink of her dog tags against her zipper. They reached the flight line, a vast expanse of concrete shimmering in the early morning heat. A white, unmarked Gulfstream sat waiting, its engines already spooling up with a scream that felt like a physical weight against Elena's chest. This wasn't a military transport. This was a gray flight, the kind used by the three-letter agencies to move assets they didn't want on a manifest. The SUV stopped. Shepard climbed out and opened the rear door. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer a goodbye. She just stood there, her face a mask of professional detachment. "This is as far as I go, Sergeant," Shepard said. Elena stepped out into the wind from the jet engines. The heat was intense, the air smelling of JP-8 and burnt ozone. She looked at the plane, then back at the colonel. "Thank you, ma'am," Elena said. Shepard's jaw tightened. "For what?" "For believing the signal," Elena said, "even if you couldn't say it." Shepard looked at her for a long time, her eyes searching Elena's face. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The silence between them was an acknowledgement of everything that had happened, everything that had been lost, and the impossible truth they both carried. Shepard turned and walked back to the SUV. Elena turned toward the plane. A man in a dark suit was standing at the bottom of the air stairs, a tablet in his hand. He didn't look like a soldier. He didn't look like an investigator. He looked like a man who spent his life in soundproof rooms, deciding which truths were allowed to exist and which were not. "Staff Sergeant Vance," he said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "Follow me." Elena climbed the stairs. The interior of the plane was luxurious but sterile, leather seats, polished wood, the air smelling of expensive coffee and filtered oxygen. There were no other passengers. She sat in one of the rear seats and buckled her belt. The man in the suit sat across from her, his fingers dancing across the screen of his tablet. "We have a long flight ahead of us, Sergeant," he said, without looking up. "I suggest you get some sleep." "I'm not tired, sir," Elena said. The man looked up then, his eyes a cold, pale blue. "You've been through a significant trauma, Sergeant. Your medical records indicate a total loss of high-frequency hearing in the left ear and multiple concussive events. You're lucky to be alive." "I'm lucky I heard the signal," Elena said. The man's expression didn't change. "There was no signal, Sergeant. We've been over this. You experienced a sensory hallucination brought on by extreme stress and environmental factors. The observatory was a defunct research station, and the Gray Jackets were a private security firm acting without authorization. The matter is closed." Elena felt the piece of shrapnel in her pocket, its jagged edge pressing against her thigh. She thought about the man in the observatory, the way his eyes had looked when the bullet hit him. She thought about the silver device and the way the earth had groaned under its pulse. "If the matter is closed, sir, why am I on this plane?" The man leaned back, a small, cold smile touching his lips. Because you're a unique asset, Sergeant. Your hallucinations were remarkably specific. We want to understand how a human brain can process seismic data with such accuracy, even if that data was coincidental. He looked back at his tablet. You're not going to a hospital, Elena. You're going to a laboratory. Elena felt a sudden, sharp spike of fear. Not the fear of a soldier in a firefight, but the fear of a person who is being turned into a specimen. They didn't want to help her. They wanted to dissect her. They wanted to understand the ghost hunter so they could build a better trap. The plane began to taxi, the vibration of the engines increasing until it was a roar that filled the cabin. Elena looked out the window, watching the Mojave disappear beneath them. The desert looked peaceful from the air, a vast, golden landscape that betrayed nothing of the secrets hidden beneath its surface. She thought about Miller, about Kalen, about Holloway. She thought about the millions of people who were waking up on the West Coast, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was still solid only because of a disgraced sergeant and a broken signal. She felt the weight of the silence in her left ear. It was her armor. It was her sanctuary. They could take her to a laboratory, they could run their tests, they could try to map her brain, but they would never find the signal. The signal wasn't in her brain, it was in her soul. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. She tuned out the hum of the jet, the whisper of the air conditioning, the tapping of the man's fingers on his tablet. She listened to the silence. And in the silence, she heard it. A new frequency. A deep, rhythmic thrum that was different from the one at the observatory. It was coming from the east, a steady, pulsing beat that felt like a heartbeat. She opened her eyes and looked at the man in the suit. He was still focused on his tablet, unaware that the world was shifting again. Elena Vance smiled. The ghosts were still moving. The grid was still active. The war was just beginning, and she was the only one who could hear it. As the Gulf Stream climbed into the thin, cold air above the Mojave, Elena Vance let the vibration of the world take her. She wasn't a prisoner. She wasn't a specimen. She was the listener, and the Earth had a lot more to say. The Gulf Stream began its descent into the heavy, moisture-laden air of Northern Virginia just as the sun was beginning to bleed over the Atlantic, a bruised purple smear against a slate-gray horizon. Elena Vance watched the condensation trail across the thick plexiglass of the window, the droplets vibrating in a frantic, shimmering dance that mirrored the 400 Hz hum of the cabin's electrical system. In her right ear, the world was a cacophony of mechanical whispers. The whine of the hydraulics, the rhythmic thrum of the air scrubbers, the low-frequency growl of the landing gear doors cycling open. In her left ear, there was only the vast, heavy velvet of the silence. It was a physical weight, a phantom limb of sound that she found herself reaching for and finding empty. The man in the charcoal suit, whom she had mentally dubbed the handler, hadn't spoken since they crossed the Mississippi. He was a creature of silence himself, his attention focused entirely on the scrolling data on his tablet, his face illuminated by the cold, blue light of the screen. He didn't look like a man who enjoyed the dawn. He looked like a man who lived in the spaces between seconds, where the messy realities of human life were distilled into actionable intelligence. The tires hit the tarmac at Dulles with a jarring, percussive thud that sent a sharp spike of pain through Elena's jaw. She didn't flinch. She simply tightened her grip on the armrests, her knuckles turning the color of bleached bone. As the plane taxied toward a private hangar far removed from the main terminals, she saw a fleet of black Suburbans waiting, their engines idling, sending plumes of white exhaust into the humid morning air. There were no welcoming committees, no military police in dress uniforms, no banners. There was only the cold, efficient machinery of the state, preparing to ingest a piece of itself that had become too complicated to leave in the light. She felt the piece of shrapnel in her pocket, the jagged fragment of the rocket Holloway had given her, and she let the sharp edge press into her thumb. It was her only anchor to the Mojave, to the smell of sagebrush and the terrifying, beautiful resonance of the observatory. Everything else was being scrubbed away, replaced by the sterile, high-gloss finish of this new reality. The transition from the plane to the SUV was a blur of motion and muffled sound. The air in Virginia was thick enough to chew, a swampy, cloying heat that felt alien after the bone-dry intensity of the desert. They drove in a silent convoy, bypassing the congestion of I-576 and weaving through the backroads of Fairfax County. Elena watched the trees go by, heavy, deep green oaks and maples that looked like they were drowning in their own leaves. It was too lush, too quiet, too hidden. In the desert, you could see a threat coming from miles away. Here, the world was built of shadows and blind corners. They eventually turned into a gated entrance that looked like the headquarters of a mid-level tech firm, all glass and brushed steel, tucked behind a screen of weeping willows. There was no sign, only a keypad and a retinal scanner that the driver engaged without slowing down. This was the facility Shepard had mentioned, a secure medical wing that didn't appear on any map, a place where assets were brought to be recalibrated or retired. They led her through a series of pressurized doors and into a room that looked more like a high-end hotel suite than a hospital ward. There were soft, recessed lights, a queen-sized bed with high thread count sheets, and a window that overlooked a small, enclosed courtyard filled with manicured ferns. It was a gilded cage, designed to soothe the nerves of people who had seen too much. But Elena saw the cameras in the corners, the reinforced glass, and the way the door locked with a heavy, magnetic click that resonated through the floorboards. She stood in the center of the room, her small bag still clutched in her hand, and waited. She was used to waiting. A signal sergeant's life was 90% waiting for a frequency to clear, for a voice to break through the static. She could wait out the world if she had to. An hour later, the door opened and a woman in a white lab coat entered. She was in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver hair pulled back into a severe bun. She carried a tablet and a small, handheld diagnostic tool. She didn't introduce herself by name, only by function. "I'm Dr. Aristone," she said, her voice a soft, cultured soprano that had the precision of a scalpel. "I've been tasked with your recovery and evaluation, Sergeant Vance." "I'm not sick, Doctor," Elena said, her voice sounding thin and strange in her own head. "No, you're damaged," Aristone corrected, stepping closer. "Sensorineural hearing loss, grade 4, multiple concussive events, and a highly unusual neurological profile that we need to understand." She held up the diagnostic tool, a penlight that flickered with a strange, orange hue. "Follow the light, Elena." Elena followed the light. She endured the tests, the scans, the endless questions about the hallucinations she had experienced at the Oak Haven Observatory. She knew the game they were playing. They wanted to see if she could still hear the ghost signals. They wanted to know if the damage had destroyed the capability or if it had merely masked it. She gave them nothing. She spoke in the flat, detached tone of a soldier reporting a routine equipment failure. She described the acoustic blast as a physical sensation of pressure, not a sound. She described the man in the observatory as a terrorist, not a conductor. She lied with the professional discipline of someone who had been trained to protect the frequency at all costs. She knew that if they realized she could still feel the earth, she would never leave this room. She would become a permanent part of the laboratory, a human sensor suite tuned to the movements of the world. The days in the facility began to bleed together into a gray, featureless smear. She was subjected to hours of acoustic testing, tones that ranged from the subsonic to the ultrasonic, played at varying volumes and frequencies. She sat in a Faraday cage, the silence pressing against her eardrums like a physical weight, while Aristone watched her through a glass partition. Elena learned to control her heart rate, to keep her pupils from dilating when she felt a particular vibration hit the base of her skull. She learned to mimic the responses of a woman who was truly, profoundly deaf on one side. It was a performance that cost her everything: the constant vigilance, the suppression of her own instincts, the denial of the very thing that made her whole. She felt like she was erasing herself, 1 decibel at a time. In the quiet moments, when the doctors were gone and the recessed lights dimmed to a soft amber, Elena would sit by the window and look out at the ferns. She would put her hand against the glass and wait. The Virginia soil was different from the Mojave. It was wet, heavy, and silent. There was no deep tectonic groaning here, no sense of a planet trying to tear itself apart. But every now and then, late at night, she would feel a pulse. a low, rhythmic thrum that didn't come from the ground, but from the building itself. It was the sound of a massive, underground server farm, or perhaps a cooling system for a reactor. It was a man-made frequency, a sharp, artificial heartbeat that felt like a needle scratching across the surface of her mind. She realized then that the Oakhaven technology hadn't been destroyed. They were trying to replicate it here, in the basement of this medical facility. They were trying to build their own resonance grid, to map the world's vulnerabilities from the comfort of a Northern Virginia office park. The realization brought with it a cold, diamond-hard rage. She thought of Miller, his face shattered and his career ended. She thought of Kalen, losing his leg in a desert that didn't officially exist. She thought of the men in suits and the way they had buried the truth to protect a project they intended to steal for themselves. They hadn't stopped the apocalypse, they had just privatized it. She was no longer a soldier serving a country. She was a witness to a crime committed by the very institution she had sworn to defend. The loyalty she felt, the fierce, uncompromising loyalty to the mission, shifted. The mission was no longer about following orders. It was about protecting the signal from the people who wanted to use it as a weapon. One evening, about 3 weeks into her stay, the handler returned. He didn't come to her room, he met her in a small, windowless office in the administrative wing. He looked tired, the skin beneath his eyes dark and papery. He pushed a stack of papers across the desk toward her. "These are your final discharge papers, Sergeant," he said. "Line of duty retirement. Medical pension. Full benefits. We've even arranged for a civilian job in data analysis at a firm in Alexandria. High pay, low stress. You'll be well taken care of. And the condition?" Elena asked, her voice steady. The handler leaned forward, his pale eyes locking onto hers. "You know the condition, Elena. You never speak of the Mojave, you never speak of the signal, you become a ghost. If you do that, you get to have a life. If you don't, well, we've already discussed the alternative." Elena looked at the papers. She saw the seal of the Department of the Army, the signatures of generals who had never heard her name, the legal language that turned her sacrifice into a clerical error. She thought about Montana, about the cold, clear water of the lakes, and the way the wind sounded through the pines. She could go back. She could buy a small house, get a dog, and spend the rest of her days in a world that was quiet and simple. She could let the silence in her left ear be the end of the story. "I need to see the data first," she said. The handler frowned. "What data?" "The data from the testing," Elena said. "I want to see the audiograms. I want to see the neurological scans. I'm a signal sergeant, sir. I don't sign off on a report until I've seen the raw feed." The handler hesitated, then nodded. He turned the tablet around and swiped through a series of charts. Elena leaned in, her eyes scanning the lines with practiced efficiency. She wasn't looking at the hearing tests. She was looking at the background noise, the ambient frequencies recorded by the sensors during her sessions in the Faraday cage. She saw it then. A tiny, 14 Hz spike that appeared every night at 0215. It was a resonant frequency, a signature of a specific type of induction field. They were testing the grid. They were pulsing the earth, right beneath her feet, and they were doing it on a schedule. She felt a surge of cold clarity. They weren't just replicating the technology, they were refining it. They were looking for the same soft spots the man in the observatory had been hunting, but they were doing it with the full weight of the American military-industrial complex behind them. The men in suits weren't there to stop the threat, they were there to take over the project. She looked up at the handler. "The charts look fine," she said, her voice a whisper of steel. "Where do I sign?" She signed the papers with a steady hand, her signature a sharp, aggressive slash of ink. She took the copies, tucked them into her bag, and walked out of the office. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what she was going to do. The civilian job in Alexandria was located in a nondescript brick building near the waterfront. It was a data clearinghouse for a defense contractor, a place where retired analysts spent their days sorting through mountains of SIGINT that had already been stripped of its context. Elena was given a cubicle, a high-speed terminal, and a security clearance that was impressive on paper but useless in practice. She was being managed. They had placed her in a controlled environment where they could watch her every move, where her daily routine was as predictable as the tides of the Potomac. But they had forgotten one thing. They had forgotten that Elena Vance didn't need a terminal to hear the world. She spent her days at the desk, her fingers moving over the keyboard with mechanical precision while her mind was elsewhere. She was mapping the building. She was tracking the vibrations of the HVAC system, the elevator motors, the distant rumble of the Blue Line trains passing underground. She was building a mental model of the local resonance, looking for the 14 hertz pulse she had seen in the laboratory. She found it on her 4th day. It was faint, a mere ghost of a vibration that moved through the soles of her shoes at exactly 0215 every morning. It wasn't coming from her building. It was coming from a facility further south, near the grounds of Fort Belvoir. Elena began to spend her evenings walking. She walked for miles along the river, her head down, her hands in her pockets, a small, solitary figure in a sea of commuters. She wasn't looking at the scenery. She was listening. She would stop at certain points, leaning against a lamppost or sitting on a park bench, and she would wait. She was looking for the nodes. If they were building a grid, there had to be induction points, places where the frequency could be injected into the crust. In the desert, they used observatories. In a suburban landscape like Northern Virginia, they would use something else, something invisible. Cell towers, substations, water treatment plants. She found the first one in a small park near Mount Vernon. It was a nondescript utility shed, surrounded by a chain-link fence and a danger, high-voltage sign. To anyone else, it was just a piece of the infrastructure that kept the lights on. To Elena, it was a tuning fork. She could feel the hum of it from 50 yards away, a sharp, crystalline vibration that made her teeth ache. She didn't go near it. She didn't need to. She just marked the location in her mind and kept walking. By the end of the month, she had mapped 6 of them. They formed a perfect hexagon, centered on a massive, underground bunker near the Raven Rock complex. It was a resonance field designed to stabilize the local crust while they experimented with deeper, more powerful pulses. They were practicing. They were learning how to play the earth like an instrument, and they were doing it in the heart of the most densely populated region of the country. One night, as she was sitting on her small balcony overlooking the river, she felt a change. The air was still, the water of the Potomac as flat as a mirror. But beneath her feet, the ground began to shiver. It wasn't the 14 hertz pulse. It was something else, something deeper. A slow, rolling vibration that felt like the earth was taking a long, shuddering breath. It lasted for only a few seconds, but it was enough. Elena stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew that sound. She had heard it in the Mojave, just before the technical had been swallowed by the sand. They were losing control. They were pushing the frequency too hard, trying to reach a depth the crust couldn't sustain. The resonance was beginning to feedback, a slow-motion acoustic collapse that would eventually trigger a seismic event the likes of which the East Coast had never seen. And they didn't know. They were sitting in their soundproof rooms, looking at their digital displays, unaware that the physical world was already beginning to fracture. Elena went inside and opened her bag. She pulled out the piece of shrapnel Holloway had given her. She held it in her hand, the jagged edges cutting into her palm, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of clarity. She couldn't stop the grid from the outside. She didn't have the tools, the authority, or the voice, but she knew the frequency. She knew the secret architecture of the world, and she knew how to break the resonance. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't leave a note. She simply walked out of her apartment and headed toward the river. She wasn't going to Fort Belvoir. She was going to the source. She was going back to the laboratory. The facility in Great Falls was quiet when she arrived, the weeping willows swaying in the light breeze. Elena didn't try to sneak in. She walked straight up to the gate and held out her old military ID. The guard, a young man who looked like he had been recruited straight out of a community college security program, looked at the ID, then at her. "You're not on the list for tonight, Sergeant," he said, his voice hesitant. "I forgot my medical files," Elena said, her voice flat and professional. "Doctor Aristone told me to come back and get them before the morning shift. Check the logs. I was here 3 weeks ago." The guard hesitated, then swiped the card. The system hesitated, then beeped. The administrative hold Shepard had placed on her file was still active, but it hadn't been revoked. To the computer, she was still a person of interest who was supposed to be in the building. The gate hummed open. Elena walked through the glass doors and headed for the medical wing. She didn't go to her old room. She went to the acoustic lab, the heart of the testing facility. The hallways were empty, the only sound the soft, rhythmic clicking of her boots on the linoleum. She reached the lab and pressed her hand against the retinal scanner. It took 3 tries, her heart racing as the red laser scanned her eye, but then the door hissed open. The lab was dark, the only light coming from the racks of servers in the corner. In the center of the room stood the Faraday cage, a silent, silver cube that looked like a monument to the silence she had lived in for the last month. Elena walked to the control console. She didn't need to hack the system. She had watched Aristone operate it for hundreds of hours. She knew the sequences, the passwords, the bypasses. She began to type. She wasn't looking for the data. She was looking for the output. She found the link to the Belvoir grid, a high-speed fiber optic connection that carried the pulse commands to the induction nodes. She saw the frequency they were running, 18, 4 Hz with a modulation of 0, 5. It was too high. The feedback loop was already at 80%. She felt the vibration in the floor again, stronger this time, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from the very foundations of the building. Somewhere in the distance, an alarm began to chime, a soft, polite sound that didn't match the urgency of the moment. Elena Vance didn't hesitate. She didn't think about her pension, her career, or the prison cell that was waiting for her. She thought about the signal. She thought about the way the world sounded when it was in balance. She entered the command for a counter-resonance pulse. It was a high-frequency burst, a white noise for the Earth that would shatter the induction field and reset the grid. It was the same thing she had done at the observatory, but this time, she didn't have a silver device. She had the entire facility's power supply. The servers began to scream, their cooling fans spinning up to a frantic whine. The lights in the lab flickered, then turned a deep, emergency red. Elena stood at the console, her hands flat on the cold metal, and she felt the pulse. It was a massive, surging wave of energy that moved through the building and into the ground. It was a sound that didn't exist in the human range of hearing, but she felt it in every bone in her body. The floor buckled. A hairline fracture appeared in the reinforced glass of the Faraday cage, spreading like a spiderweb. The building groaned, the sound of steel being twisted by an invisible hand. And then, suddenly, it was over. The vibration stopped. The hum of the servers died away. The emergency lights faded to black. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing Elena Vance had ever heard. It was a clean silence, a natural silence. The grid was dead. The resonance was broken. The earth was still. She stood in the darkness for a long time, her chest heaving, her hands shaking. She knew what was coming next. She could hear the sirens in the distance, the sound of tires screaming on the pavement, the shouts of the security teams. They would find her here. They would take her back to the men in suits, and this time there would be no discharge papers. There would be no hotel suite. But she didn't care. She had done the one thing she was born to do. She had listened, and she had answered. The door to the lab burst open, and a team of men in tactical gear flooded into the room, their weapon lights cutting through the darkness like white needles. They didn't shout. They didn't order her to the ground. They just surrounded her, their faces hidden behind gas masks and visors. Elena Vance stood her ground. She didn't reach for her bag. She didn't try to run. She simply raised her hands, the piece of shrapnel still clutched in her right palm. One of the men stepped forward. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing a charcoal suit. He looked at the console, then at the shattered glass of the Faraday cage, then at Elena. "You have no idea what you've just done, Sergeant," he said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "I know exactly what I've done, sir," Elena said, her voice sounding louder and clearer than it had in weeks. "I saved the signal." The man looked at her for a long time, his eyes filled with a cold, simmering hatred. He didn't order her arrest. He didn't call for a medic. He simply turned to his team. "Take her to the basement," he said, "and bring Dr. Aristone. We're going to need to start over." The basement was not a hotel suite. It was a small, concrete box with a single, steel door and a narrow slit for a window. There was a cot, a toilet, and a sink. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and old electricity. It was the place they kept the things they couldn't throw away but couldn't leave in the light. It was the end of the line. Elena sat on the cot and leaned her head against the cold concrete wall. She felt the silence in her left ear, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a secret, a place where the men in suits could never reach. Days passed, or perhaps weeks. Time didn't exist in the basement. There were no clocks, no sun, no seasons. There was only the sound of the door opening to deliver a tray of bland, lukewarm food and the occasional visit from Dr. Aristone. The doctor didn't talk about recovery anymore. She talked about compliance. She talked about the responsibility of those with extraordinary gifts. She talked about the greater good. Elena didn't listen. She sat on her cot and she felt the wall. She was still a signal sergeant. She was still a ghost hunter, and the earth was still there. One night the door opened, but it wasn't the guard with a tray. It was Colonel Shepard. She looked different. She wasn't wearing her flight suit. She was wearing a civilian coat, her face pale and drawn. She looked like a woman who had lost a war she didn't know she was fighting. She walked into the cell and stood by the cot, looking down at Elena. "They told me you were dead, Vance," Shepard said, her voice a raspy whisper. "They told me you died in a car accident in Alexandria." "I'm a ghost, Colonel," Elena said, her voice thin and dry. "Remember?" Shepard sat on the edge of the cot, her weight causing the springs to groan. "I found the report, Elena. The real one, the counter-resonance pulse. You didn't just break the grid, you destroyed the data. They have the nodes, they have the hardware, but they don't have the tuning. They don't know how to play the song." Elena looked at her. "And you, why are you here?" Shepard looked at her hands. "I'm being forced out, Elena, early retirement. They found out I was digging into the Oak Haven files. They're cleaning house. I'm leaving for Montana tomorrow." Elena felt a sharp, sudden pang of longing. Montana, the cold air, the sound of the pines. "I wish I could see the mountains again, ma'am." Shepard reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She pressed it into Elena's hand. "This is the address of my ranch, near Big Timber. If you ever get out of here, Vance, you have a place." Elena took the paper, her fingers trembling. "Thank you, Colonel." Shepard stood up, her jaw set in a hard, professional line. "I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry I couldn't do more. You did enough, ma'am. You believed the signal." Shepard looked at her one last time, a flicker of something like grief in her eyes, and then she walked out of the cell. The door locked with a heavy, magnetic click. Elena sat in the silence and unfolded the paper. She memorized the address, the coordinates, the name of the road. She folded it back up and tucked it into her shoe, beneath the insole. It was her new mission, her new signal. Months went by, the testing stopped, the questions stopped. Dr. Aristone stopped coming. Elena was left alone in her concrete box, a ghost in a machine that had no use for her anymore. She spent her days walking in circles, 3 steps forward, 3 steps back. She spent her nights with her head against the wall, listening to the world. She could still feel it, the deep, subsonic thrum of the planet. It was different now. It was quieter, more stable. The men in suits had given up on the grid, at least for now. They had moved on to other projects, other threats, other ways to weaponize the silence. But Elena Vance was still there. She was the one who knew the truth. She was the one who had seen the world break and had put it back together again. She was the listener. One morning, the door opened. It wasn't the guard. It was the handler. He looked older, his hair thinner, his suits fitting more loosely on his frame. He stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, looking at her with an expression that was hard to read. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't pity. It was exhaustion. "We're moving you, Vance," he said. "Where to?" "A specialized care facility in Colorado. It's quiet, it's remote. You'll have a room with a view of the mountains. You'll have books, music, and medical care. You'll never have to worry about anything again." Elena stood up, her back straight, her hands at her sides. "And the catch? There is no catch, Elena. The project is over. The grid is gone. You're a liability we can no longer afford to keep in a basement, but you're a secret we can never let go. This is the best we can do for you." Elena looked at him. She saw the truth in his eyes. They weren't moving her to a laboratory. They were moving her to a graveyard for ghosts. A place where she would be comfortable, cared for, and utterly, completely forgotten. "I want to see the sky first," she said. The handler hesitated, then nodded. He stepped aside, and Elena walked out of the cell. She walked through the long, sterile hallways, up the elevators, and through the pressurized doors. She walked past the security teams, the cameras, and the retinal scanners. She walked out of the building and into the cool, crisp air of a Virginia morning. The sun was just beginning to rise, a pale, golden light that filtered through the leaves of the weeping willows. The air smelled of rain and honeysuckle. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She stood on the gravel driveway and looked at the sky. It was vast, blue, and endless. She felt the wind on her face, the warmth of the sun on her skin. She felt the vibration of the world, the distant hum of the highway, the rustle of the trees, the heartbeat of the earth. She wasn't a prisoner. She wasn't a specimen. She wasn't a hero. She was Staff Sergeant Elena Vance, and she was still listening. The handler walked up beside her, his face illuminated by the morning light. "Are you ready?" Elena turned to him. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She simply nodded and climbed into the back of the waiting SUV. As the vehicle began to move, Elena leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. She felt the piece of paper in her shoe, the coordinate of a ranch in Big Timber. She felt the silence in her left ear, the sanctuary of the things she would never tell. She thought about the Mojave, about the observatory, about the man who had wanted to break the world. She thought about Miller and Kalin and Halloway. She thought about the mission. The mission wasn't over. It had just changed. She was no longer protecting a frequency. She was protecting a truth. And as long as she was breathing, that truth would stay alive. She felt the vibration of the engine, the resonance of the road, the deep, steady pulse of the earth beneath the tires. In the quiet of the SUV, Elena Vance began to hum. It wasn't a song she had ever heard. It was a frequency, a low, rhythmic vibration that matched the heartbeat of the planet. She was a ghost hunter, and she had finally found her ghost. The convoy wound its way through the lush, green hills of Virginia, heading toward a private airfield where a plane was waiting to take her to the mountains. Elena watched the world go by, the small towns, the white fences, the quiet lives of people who would never know her name. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She had paid the cost. She had given her hearing, her career, and her identity to the silence. But in return, she had found something permanent, something real. She looked at her hand, at the small, jagged scar where the shrapnel had cut her. It was a mark of the truth. A physical memory of the moment she had chosen the world over the institution. She leaned her head against the window and watched the sun climb higher into the sky. The light was blinding, a brilliant, white fire that seemed to wash away the shadows of the basement. She thought about the ranch in Big Timber. She thought about the cold air and the sound of the pines. She thought about a life where the only signal she had to follow was the changing of the seasons. The SUV stopped at the edge of the tarmac. The handler opened the door and offered his hand. Elena didn't take it. She stepped out on her own, her boots hitting the concrete with a sharp, percussive crack. She looked at the plane, a small, white Cessna waiting in the morning light. She looked at the mountains on the horizon, the jagged, blue peaks of the Blue Ridge. She turned to the handler. "One more thing," she said. The handler looked at her, his expression weary. "What is it, Vance? If you ever try to build it again," Elena said, her voice a low, modulated hum that seemed to vibrate the very air between them. "If you ever try to touch the resonance, I'll hear you." The handler stared at her, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He saw the truth in her gaze, the cold, uncompromising discipline of a woman who had seen the apocalypse and hadn't flinched. Elena Vance turned and walked toward the plane. She climbed the stairs and sat in the small, cramped cabin. She buckled her belt and watched the hangar disappear as the plane began to taxi. The engine roared, the vibration filling the cabin, but Elena didn't hear the noise. She heard the music. She heard the deep, subsonic thrum of the earth, the beautiful, terrifying symphony of power and pressure. She closed her eyes and let the sound take her. The plane lifted off the ground, climbing into the thin, cold air of the morning. Elena felt the shift in pressure, the way the world fell away beneath them. She felt the silence in her left ear, a vast and holy space where the truth could live. She was Staff Sergeant Elena Vance. She was a signal sergeant. She was a ghost hunter. And she was going home. The ranch in Big Timber sat at the end of a long, gravel road that wound through a forest of lodgepole pines and Douglas firs. It was a modest place, a log cabin with a wraparound porch, a small barn, and a view of the crazy mountains that took Elena's breath away every time she looked at it. Shepard had been waiting for her on the porch, a cup of coffee in her hand and a dog at her feet. They hadn't said much. There was no need for explanations or apologies. They were two women who had survived the same war, and they understood the value of the silence. Elena spent her days working the land. She cleared brush, repaired fences, and helped Shepard with the horses. She learned the rhythms of the mountains, the way the light changed before a storm, the way the air smelled when the snow was coming, the way the earth felt beneath her boots. She was still a soldier in her own way. She lived a life of discipline, of action, of quiet competence. She still had the hearing loss. The left side of her world was still a shadow, but she had learned to live with it. She had learned that the silence wasn't a void, it was a sanctuary. In the evenings, she would sit on the porch and watch the sun go down. She would put her hand against the rough wood of the railing and she would feel the vibration. It wasn't the artificial pulse of the grid or the terrifying moan of a failing crust. It was just the earth. The slow, steady heartbeat of a world that was still solid, still real, still alive. She thought about the men in suits sometimes. She thought about the laboratory in Great Falls and the basement in Northern Virginia. She wondered if they were still searching for the frequency, still trying to map the ghosts. She hoped they weren't, but she knew that if they were, she would know. She would feel it in the soles of her feet, in the marrow of her bones, in the silence of her left ear. She was the listener, and the signal was hers. One evening, in late autumn, the first snow began to fall. The flakes were large and wet, drifting down from a slate-gray sky like pieces of a broken world. Elena stood on the porch and watched the mountains disappear behind a curtain of white. The air was cold and smelled of pine and winter. She felt a vibration, a low, rhythmic thrum that came from the ground. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a machine. It was just the earth, shifting its weight as the cold settled into the soil. Elena Vance smiled. She closed her eyes and she listened. She heard the wind through the pines. She heard the distant call of a hawk. She heard the soft, steady rhythm of her own heart, and beneath it all she heard the song. The earth was breathing. The world was at peace. And for the first time in her life, Elena Vance was home. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the piece of shrapnel. She held it up to the falling snow, watching the way the white flakes settled on the jagged, scorched metal. She had carried it for a long time. She had carried the weight of the Mojave, the cost of the truth, and the burden of the silence. She walked to the edge of the porch and threw the metal into the snow. She watched it disappear, a small, dark shadow in a world that was turning white. She didn't need it anymore. She didn't need the memory of the apocalypse to know who she was. She was the woman who had heard the world when it was about to break, and she was the woman who had helped it stay whole. Elena Vance turned and walked back into the cabin, the heavy wooden door closing with a soft, solid thud. The light from the fireplace flickered through the window, a warm, amber glow in the gathering darkness. The mountains were gone, hidden behind the snow. The road was silent. The world was quiet. But in the center of the cabin, in the heart of the silence, Elena Vance could still hear the signal. She sat by the fire and let the warmth soak into her bones. She felt the vibration of the flames, the resonance of the wood, the deep, steady pulse of the planet. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The snow continued to fall, covering the ranch, the road, and the mountains in a blanket of white. It covered the piece of shrapnel in the dirt. It covered the tracks of the past. The earth was quiet. The silence was perfect, and the signal was clear.